Have you ever stood at the mouth of a valley in the last light of a winter afternoon and felt, without being able to say why, that the place was already full? Not crowded, not busy, full the way a held breath is full. Have you ever noticed how snow, when it falls in a narrow hollow with steep sides, does not seem to fall so much as arrive, settling into every hollow and hoofprint until the ground forgets it ever had a shape of its own? And have you ever wondered, standing at a threshold like that, whether the reason no birds are singing is that they have all left or that they have all learned to be quiet? I want to tell you about a place where people learn to be quiet. It is a real place, or it was, in the mountains of Kellam County, in a fold of ground the old survey maps called Sorrel Hollow, and the people who lived nearby simply called the Notch. And I want to tell you about a man named Elias Renner, 29 years old, who walked into that hollow in the last week of November, in the year 1891, to count the people living there, and who came out changed and counting a different thing entirely 9 days later. Most of what we know because Elias Renner wrote it down. He was, by training and by temperament, a man who wrote things down. That habit is the only reason you and I get to sit here in the warm and the light and hear this at all. Before I take you in there with him, though, I need to tell you something, and I'd rather tell you now, at the start, while the door is still open behind us. If this is the kind of story that gets into you, the slow kind, the kind that doesn't jump out, but instead just quietly sits down beside you and won't leave, then I've put together a collection you might want. It's called What the Snow Kept, and it's 12 of these, 12 winters, 12 hollows, a little over 10 hours of them in all, meant to be listened to in the dark with the lamp low. This is one of the 12. If you want the rest, the link's below. But before I go on, do me a small thing. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Put your town, your county, your country in the comments. I like to see how far into the dark this reaches, how many rooms and how many places have this playing low right now. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means the next one of these finds its own way to you when it's ready. That's all. Now then, let me take you into the Notch, the way Elias Renner went in, not knowing a single thing that you and I are about to learn together. The winter of 1891 came early to Kellam County. The county records and Kellam County kept unusually good records for a place that poor, which will matter later show, the first hard frost on the 9th of October, 3 weeks ahead of the average, and the first real snow, 4 inches of it, on the 2nd of November. By the middle of that month, the high roads were already closing. This is the country you have to picture. Not the soft, rolling green mountains of a postcard, but steep, close-shouldered ridges that come together in narrow V-shaped valleys so that the sun in a hollow, like Sorrel, might clear the eastern ridge at 9 in the morning and drop behind the western one by 3 in the afternoon. 6 hours of light. In summer, the hollows are damp and dense and loud with water and insects. In winter, they go silent and blue, and the silence in them is not the absence of sound. It is a presence. Anyone who has spent a night alone in country like that will tell you the same thing, and they will lower their voice a little when they tell you. And you have to understand how the people of that country lived with their hollows, because it is not the way we live with places now, and the difference is, the whole reason a sorrel hollow could exist for 40 years and never be stopped. These were not people who wrote things down and mapped things and put up signs. They were people who knew their country the way you know a face in the body, by long acquaintance without needing it explained. And they carried in that knowing a whole quiet freight of things that were not superstition exactly and were not religion exactly, but were something older and more practical than either. A folk knowledge of which ground was good and which was bad, which spring went dry in a drought, and which never did, which stretch of woods the deer avoided for no reason a man could see, and which hollows you did not build in, did not linger in after dark, did not send your children into alone. Every county in those mountains had a place or two like that, a bad hollow, a haunted bend, a piece of ground the old people would nod at and say only, "We don't go up there," and would not say more, and did not need to, because everyone raised in that country already knew. It was not a thing they feared, quite. It was a thing they lived alongside, the way you live alongside a bull in a field or a bad stretch of river, with respect, with distance, with a set of unspoken rules so deep in the bone that no one remembered being taught them. And the tragedy, the thing that let the hollows keep feeding down the generations, was that this kind of knowing does not survive being written down, and it does not survive the young leaving, and it does not survive a stranger with a deed and a dream of cheap, pretty land, because the stranger was never raised in the bone knowledge, was never told at his mother's knee, "We don't go up there," sees only a lovely, quiet valley with a creek and good timber, and no one living in it, and cannot imagine how could he, that the reason no one lives in it is the truest and oldest warning the country has to give. Sorrel Hollow was one of those places. The people of Kellam County knew not to go up there. They had always known, and they were, by 1891, the last generation that would know it in the old, unspoken way, and the state of West Virginia, in its wisdom, in the person of an educated young man from a river town who had never once in his life been told, "We don't go up there," was about to send someone in to count it. Elias Renner was not from that country. He was from Wheeling, a river town, a place of coal smoke and steamboats and noise, and he had come to Kellam County by way of a job with the census, not the great federal census, which had been taken the year before, in 1890, but a supplementary agricultural and mortality enumeration the state of West Virginia had commissioned for its own reasons, chiefly to figure out how many people were quietly dying in its back hollows without anyone ever writing it down. It is a grim little irony, when you think about it, that Elias Renner was sent into Sorrel Hollow specifically to record deaths that the official count had missed. He went in looking for the uncounted dead. He did not expect to find them looking back. I said he was a man who wrote things down, and I want you to understand what kind of man that made him, because it matters for everything that follows. Renner's notebooks. There are 3 of them that survive, and I have read transcriptions of all 3, and I'll be quoting them to you as we go, are not the notebooks of an excitable man. They are dry. They are precise. He records the temperature 4 times a day. He records the exact distance he has walked, in miles and in his own paces, which he had calibrated so that 1,000 of them made roughly half a mile. He records what he ate and what it cost. On the day his wife died, and I'll come to that, because you cannot understand this story without understanding that he wrote 3 lines, and the 3rd line is a note about the price of the coffin. That was the kind of man he was. When a man like that begins, halfway through a notebook, to write things that cannot possibly be true, and to write them in the same flat, careful hand he used for the price of a coffin, you find yourself believing him. That is the trouble with this whole story. Renner is a bad witness to have, if you want to sleep tonight, because Renner does not exaggerate, and Renner does not lie, and Renner, God help him, was there. And I should tell you, because you have a right to ask it, how any of this comes down to us at all, how a set of a dead surveyor's notebooks from 1891 ends up being read aloud to you tonight, and why you should trust the chain of it. It is not a mystery, and that is part of what makes it hard to wave away. When Elias Renner died in 1932, his effects passed, there being no wife and no children, to a nephew, his brother's son, a schoolteacher, who kept the notebooks and the daybooks in a trunk for the rest of his own life, not because he believed them, he thought them, he said. The sad, long delusion of a grief-broken uncle, a good man who had gone strange after losing his wife, but because they were family, and you keep family papers. It was that nephew's daughter, later, going through the trunk, who read the 3 Sorrel Hollow notebooks straight through, and noticed the thing that turned them from a sad old man's delusion into something that would not let her sleep, that they were consistent, not the ravings of a broken mind, which wander and contradict and inflate, but a single, sober, internally exact account, the temperatures and the paces and the prices, all correct and ordinary, right up to the edge of the impossible, and then continuing, in the same steady hand, past it. And she did the thing a careful person does. She went looking to see whether any of the checkable parts were true, and the checkable parts were true. There was a Kellam County. There had been a supplementary state enumeration in 1891. There was, in the county's surviving records, a folder on a hollow called Sorrel, or the Notch, with a report in it signed by an enumerator named E. Renner, and a recommendation that the trace be closed, and a single word written across the top of the file in another hand. There had been a teamster named Coy Aldous. There had been, in the 1880 census, a Sorrel Hollow with 31 souls in it, and a Vearn household among them. Every plain fact she could check, checked, and that is the whole horror of a witness like Renner, brought forward 60 years and handed to us. You cannot dismiss him, because he was real and careful, and right about everything a man can be checked on, and the only things he was not right about, if he was not right, are the things no one can check. The things that happen in a loft in the dark on the 9th night, the things he wrote down in the same true hand as all the rest. That is why I can tell you this story as I do, as history and not as fancy. The frame of it is documented. Only the center is impossible, and the man who wrote the center down was the last man on earth you would expect to imagine it. Elias Renner was not from that country in another sense too, a sense that matters, and I want to name it before we go in, because it is the thing that made him both the wrong man and, as it turned out, the right one to survive the place. He did not believe in any of it. Not ghosts, not haunts, not thin ground, none of it. He was a modern man, a Rivertown man, a man of instruments and figures who had grown up in the coal smoke and the steam whistles and the plain daylight machinery of the world, and he thought the old hill country warnings, the salt on the sill, the door barred against the dark, the not speaking of certain things were the quaint leavings of frightened, unlettered, isolated people. And he wrote as much, early in the first notebook, a little condescendingly, the way an educated young man will. That disbelief was the wrong thing to bring into Sorrel Hollow. It kept him from taking Coy Aldis's 3 warnings seriously. It kept him eating apples in a warm room 3 nights too long. It very nearly killed him. But it was also, in the end, the thing that saved him, because a man who does not believe in the thing is a man who keeps measuring it, keeps writing it down, keeps looking for the ordinary explanation, and it was exactly that stubborn refusal to simply accept the haunting, that compulsion to check and recheck and find the flat, true fact under the impossible one, that gave him, on the 9th night, the habit of mind he needed to look at his dead wife weeping at the door, and, instead of believing or disbelieving, to measure her, and find the one figure that did not add up, and say it out loud. The believers in that country were taken. The old woman on the ridge survived by memory, and the widow, Sallow, survived, for a while, by counting. But Renner survived by disbelief, turned into a blade by being, to the very end, a man who would not take even his own grief on faith. Hold that too, going in. It is a strange kind of hero for a ghost story. He beat the ghost by refusing, even when it wore the face he loved most, to stop checking the arithmetic. Here is the loss, since I've promised it to you twice now. Elias Renner had been married. Her name was Martha Renner, born Martha Hesse, a German cooper's daughter from the same river town, and she had died in the spring of that same year, 1891, of a fever that came on in 3 days and took her on the 4th. They had been married 2 years and 7 months. There were no children, and here is the detail I want you to hold on to, because the thing in the hollow held on to it too. Martha Renner had a habit, a small, foolish, endearing habit, of humming when she was thinking. Not singing, humming, low and tuneless, barely a sound at all, the kind of thing you'd never notice until it stopped. Renner mentions it exactly once in the surviving notebooks, in an entry from before her death, an ordinary domestic entry about a leaking roof. And he writes, "I'm giving you his words now, close to exact, that she was humming over the account book the way she always did, and that the sound of it was the sound of the house being alive. That's the whole of it. One sentence." He was not a sentimental writer, but he wrote that, and it survived. And it is the hinge on which this entire nightmare turns, so hold it. Martha hummed when she was thinking, low and tuneless, and the sound of it meant the house was alive. And I have to tell you a little more about the 8 months between her death and his walk up the sorrel trace, because the hollow did not find a whole man to work on. It found a man already worn thin by grief, already, in a sense, standing on his own thin ground before he ever reached the real one. We know the shape of those 8 months from the notebooks and from a few things the people of his later town pieced together, and it is the ordinary, devastating shape of a certain kind of quiet grief. He did not fall apart. That was the trouble. A man who falls apart gets tended, gets watched, gets pulled back. Renner did the opposite. He grew more careful. He worked more. He took the census posting, the long, lonely autumn of walking into other people's hollows and counting other people's living and dead, precisely because it kept him moving and kept him counting and kept him, above all, away from the small river town house where every object still had her hand on it, where the account book still sat with her humming soaked into it, where, he wrote once, in a line that tells you everything, "I cannot be in the house after dark, because after dark I begin to listen for a sound the house does not make any more, and I am afraid of how much I want to hear it. I am afraid of how much I want to hear it." 8 months before Sorrel Hollow, before he had ever heard of the Notch or the Vearns or the thing that hums at walls, the door was already unlatched. The wanting was already there, already exactly this shape, already a man alone in a dark house straining to hear a dead woman hum. The hollow did not build that in him. The hollow, when he walked into it, simply recognized it the way one thin place knows another, and set a woman by its fire, and had her hum. There is a cruelty in that timing so precise it can feel almost designed, though Orpheus would tell him it was not designed, that the hollow designs nothing, that it only reaches for whatever warm, reaching thing comes near, and that the reason it so often gets the grieving is simply that the grieving are the ones who come the lonely, the bereaved. The ones with an unlatched door are exactly the people who take a lonely posting in a far county, who go to live by themselves at the edge of nowhere, who wander into thin ground because thick ground, full of the living and the loved, has become unbearable to them. The hollow does not select the grieving. Grief selects the hollow. The bereaved walk toward the thin places on their own feet, for their own reasons, looking for exactly the quiet and the distance that the thin places offer, and the hunger just waits at the bottom of them, patient for the ones who come. Renner came. He came grieving and careful and alone, with a dead wife's hum in his ears that he was afraid of how much he wanted to hear, and he walked up the trace into the one place in all the world most perfectly shaped to give it back to him. Hold all of that now, as we go in. The horror of Sorrel Hollow is not that it is strange. It is that it is intimate. It knew him before he arrived. It knew all of us, a little, the ones who carry an unlatched door. That is what makes it a story worth staying up for. It is not about a monster in a valley. It is about the thing each of us keeps, unlatched, in the dark, and would open the door to, and knows we would. Now, Sorrel Hollow. Renner's assignment was simple on paper. He was to walk into the hollow, locate every dwelling, record the name, age, sex, and occupation of every living soul, and note every death in the previous 10 years with, if possible, its cause. Kellam County's clerk had given him a starting figure, drawn from the 1880 census and from the tax rolls. As of 1880, Sorrel Hollow had contained 4 households, and, by the count, 31 people. Renner was to find out how many of the 31 were still there in 1891, how many had left, and how many had died. He expected, he wrote, a routine of perhaps 2 days' work. He had done a dozen hollows already that autumn. He had a system. He was good at it. He never finished the count. And when you see the numbers he did manage to write down before the counting became something else, before he began, in that last notebook, to count in the dark with his back against a barred door, you will understand why the clerk of Kellam County, receiving Renner's papers the following spring, wrote across the top of the file a single word and then closed it, and, as far as anyone can tell, never opened it again. I'll tell you what the word was later. I want you to earn it, the way Renner did. The man who drove Elias Renner up to the mouth of the hollow was named Coy Aldous. We know a fair amount about Coy Aldous because he lived another 30 years and talked, late in life and reluctantly, to more than one person, and the accounts line up. He was a teamster and a sometime mail carrier, 50-odd years old in 1891, a widower, a man who knew every road and half the deer trails in the eastern half of Kellam County. He was paid $2 to carry Renner and Renner's gear as far up the Sorrel Road as the wagon could go, which in that snow was not all the way, and Coy Aldous. According to Renner's own notebook, and according to what Aldous himself said decades later, gave the young census-taker 3 warnings on that drive up, and then his exact remembered phrase said he would not speak of it again, and did not. I want to give you the 3 warnings the way Renner recorded them, because the way he recorded them tells you he did not, at the time, take them seriously. He wrote them down the way you'd write down a bit of local color, a quaint superstition to be reported with a raised eyebrow. He underlined none of them. He would come to know all 3 by heart. The first warning Coy Aldous gave him was this: however long you mean to stay, be down out of the hollow before full dark on the 9th day. Not the 10th, the 9th. Aldous would not say why 9, only that the hollow had a way of counting, and that 9 was the number it counted to. Renner, in his notebook, wrote the word 9, and beside it, in the margin, a small dry question mark. That question mark is the last skeptical thing in the entire record. Everything after it is belief. The second warning was this: whatever you hear at night outside the walls of wherever you're sleeping, do not answer it, do not go to the window for it, and above all, do not open the door to it. Not if it calls you by name, not if it uses a voice you know, not if it weeps. Aldous was very particular, Renner noted, about that last part. Not if it weeps, as though weeping were the trick most likely to work, as though weeping had worked before. And the third warning, the one Renner set down, almost as an afterthought, the one that would come back to him in the 9th day dark like a hand closing on his throat. The third warning was this: if you find that someone in the hollow is kind to you, kinder than a stranger has any cause to be, kind in a way that seems to know exactly what you are missing, be more afraid of that than of anything you hear in the night. Coy Aldous said it, and then he said he'd not speak of it again, and he drove the rest of the way in silence, and where the road pinched down to a snowed-over trace, he stopped the wagon and helped Renner unload his pack and his instruments. And he did not offer to shake the young man's hand, and he turned the team around in a hurry that Renner found, at the time, faintly comic. Renner watched the wagon go, and then he shouldered his pack and walked up into Sorrel Hollow, into the blue afternoon and the 6 hours of light, alone. It was a little after 1 o'clock. He had, though he did not know it, exactly 9 days. Let me tell you what the hollow looked like, because Renner told us, and because the smallness of the wrongness in it is the whole art of the thing. From the mouth, where Aldous left him, the trail followed a creek, Sorrel Creek, running black and slow under a lid of ice, up the center of a valley, perhaps 1.5 miles long, and, at its widest, 1/4 mile across. The ridges to either side were steep and thick with hardwoods, oak and hickory and poplar, bare now, gray, and above the bare trees a fringe of dark hemlock and pine along the ridge lines. The snow was maybe 6 inches on the level, more in the drifts, and it was untracked, which Renner noted with mild surprise. 4 households, 31 people as of 1880, and not a single footprint, not a sled runner, not a hoof print on the only trail in or out. He wrote it down. He wrote, "No tracks on the sorrel trace. Odd, for 4 occupied dwellings. Perhaps they keep to the ridges. Perhaps they keep to the ridges. Hold that one too. It's the first small wrong thing," and he explained it away, the way he'd explain away every small wrong thing, right up until the small wrong thing stopped being small. The first dwelling he came to was empty. It stood about 1/2 mile up the trace, a 2-room cabin of squared logs with a stone chimney, and it was not a ruin. The roof was sound, the door was shut, there was split wood stacked under the eaves, and a rope of dried apples hanging in the front room. But it was empty, and it had the particular stillness of a place that has been empty a while. No fire had been laid in the hearth in a long time. The ash was cold and settled and had a skin of dust on it. Renner recorded the cabin, measured it, noted the wood and the apples, and noted, in his careful hand, one thing that troubled him a little even then, the dried apples. They were not old. Dried apples keep, but they don't keep forever. And these were, he judged, from that autumn's crop hung to dry. Sometime in September or October, 2 months gone at most, someone had been in this cabin, doing an ordinary autumn chore within the season, and then, sometime between the stringing of the apples and the settling of the dust on the hearth ash, they had gone and left the apples and left the wood, and left the door shut against the cold that no longer had anyone inside to bite. Who strings apples for a winter they don't mean to be there for? That's the question I'd have been asking, walking through that cold front room. Renner asked it too. He wrote it down. And then, because he was who he was, he moved on to the next dwelling. Up the trace, deeper into the 6 hours of light. The second dwelling was where he met the Vearns. I have to be careful here, because the Vearn family is the part of this story that later got twisted in the retelling, and I want to give you what Renner actually recorded, not what the county came to whisper about them afterward. Because here is a thing about horror, about the real kind, the kind that leaves records. When a place goes wrong, the people who live there get blamed for it, and the blame curdles into stories, and the stories get uglier than the truth, because ugliness is easier to carry than the truth. The truth is usually stranger and sadder and colder than the stories. So set aside, for now, anything you may think you know. Let me give you the Vearns as Elias Renner first found them, on the afternoon of the 24th of November, 1891, with the light already starting its early slide down the western ridge. There were, Renner recorded, 3 of them living in the second dwelling, which was a larger cabin than the first. A full 3 rooms with a loft, well-built, well-kept, smoke rising from the chimney. The first sign of a living soul he'd seen in the hollow. 2 brothers and their sister. The brothers were Amos Vearn, 41, And Isaiah Vearn, 38. The sister was named Prudence Vearn, and she was, by Renner's record, 34 years old. And the very first thing Renner wrote about the Vearns, before their ages, before their names even, was this: that all three of them came out onto the porch to meet him before he had knocked, before, as far as he could tell, they could have seen or heard him coming, and that they were smiling. All three. The way you smile at someone you have been expecting for a long time and had almost given up on. He found it, he wrote, unaccountably warm. That's his phrase, unaccountably warm. And if you were listening closely a few minutes ago, you'll feel the cold finger that phrase should lay on the back of your neck, because it is exactly, word for word almost, the third warning Coy Aldous gave him. Kindness that seems to know what you're missing. Be more afraid of that than of anything in the night. Renner did not make the connection. Not yet. He was cold and tired and half a day into an empty hollow, and here were three living people with a fire and a smile, and he was human, and he was grieving, though he'd never have used that word, and he went up onto the porch and let them take his pack and sit him by the fire, and he was grateful. Of course he was grateful. That's how it works. That's how it always works. The trap is not the thing in the dark that weeps at your door. The trap is the warm room and the smile and the gratitude. The thing at the door on the 9th night is just the trap closing. But I'm getting ahead of us. Let me slow down. We have time. We have, in fact, exactly 9 days, and I don't want to waste them. That first evening, the 24th, the Vearns fed him. This is worth dwelling on, because Renner dwelt on it, and because food, in this story, keeps meaning more than food. They gave him a supper of cornbread and beans, and a piece of salt pork, and, at the end, a small dish of those dried apples stewed soft with a little honey. And it was, he wrote, the best meal he had eaten since leaving Wheeling. He was effusive about it, by his standards a whole paragraph, which for Renner is practically a sonnet. And he noticed, that first evening, only one small thing that struck him as strange, and even that he set down without alarm. He noticed that the three Vearns ate very little themselves. They served him generously and watched him eat, and pressed him to have more, and they took, each of them, a few small bites. And mostly they watched, and mostly they smiled, and the sister, Prudence, did not eat at all that he saw, but sat a little apart, near the fire, with her hands folded in her lap, and here it is, the first one, the first of the small impossible things she hummed, low, tuneless, barely a sound at all, the kind of thing you'd never notice until it stopped. Renner noticed. Of course, Renner noticed, but he did not, that first night, understand what he was noticing. He wrote in his notebook, that night, by the light of a candle the Vearns gave him, in the loft where they'd made him a bed of clean straw and good wool blankets, the sister hums to herself by the fire. Puts me in mind of M, a common enough habit, I suppose. A common enough habit. Puts me in mind of M. Of Marta, dead 8 months, humming over the account book, the sound of the house being alive. He wrote it down, and he did not understand it, and he blew out the candle, and he slept. That first night, better than he had slept in a long time, warm and full and grateful, in a hollow with no tracks in the snow, and an empty cabin down the trace with fresh apples hanging in a cold front room, and above him on the ridgelines the dark hemlocks stood in the dark. And the silence that was not an absence sat down all around the sleeping house and waited, because it had counted to 1, and it had 8 more to go. But I want to stay in that first night a moment longer, because there is one thing in it that Renner underlined in his memory, though not in his book, one thing he came back to over and over in the later notebooks trying to understand, and it is the kind of small wrongness you only recognize as wrongness in hindsight, after you know. He woke Once, that first night, in the deep of it, the way you wake in a strange bed not from a sound, he was certain of that, from no sound at all, but rather from the sudden absence of a sound, the way you wake when a clock you'd stopped hearing stops ticking. And he lay in the loft, in the pitch dark, and he listened, and he realized what had woken him. The house was too quiet. Not quiet the way a sleeping house is quiet, with its small, settling creaks and the breathing of the people in it. Quiet the way a held breath is quiet. Because, below him, in the cabin, the three Vearns were not making any of the sounds that three sleeping people make. No breathing, no turning over, no creak of a rope bed taking a shifted weight. Nothing. Three people in the rooms below him, and not one sound of a living body at rest all night. And Renner lay there straining to hear a single human breath from below, and heard none, and told himself they must sleep very still. Mountain people, tired people, and eventually the ordinary exhaustion of his long day pulled him back down under. And in the morning there was breakfast laid, and the three of them warm and smiling and moving about. And he forgot it, or set it aside, the way you set aside a dream. He did not know yet that the reason he heard no breathing was that there was no breathing, that the taken do not breathe in the night, because breath is for the living, and they were not, and had not been, for 12 years, and only put breath on in the daytime, along with the smiles, the way you put on a coat, because the daytime was when the stranger was awake to see. Hold that with the rest. The first night gave him the silence of the unbreathing house, and he slept through the meaning of it, the way we sleep through so many warnings, because the bed is warm, and the day was long, and we do not yet want to know. The second day, the 25th, was the day he did his first real walking of the hollow, and it is worth staying with, because it is the day the arithmetic began, and because it shows you Renner at his work, the careful man doing the careful thing, not yet afraid, cataloging a nightmare in a neat hand, without knowing it was one. He rose early, ate the breakfast the Vearns laid, ate it alone, again, under their watching, though he did not yet find the watching strange, and set out up the trace with his instruments to find and record the other dwellings. And the hollow in the morning light was beautiful, he wrote. Genuinely beautiful, blue and white and still, the creek black under its lid of ice, the bare hardwood silver with frost, and he wrote that if he had not had the empty cabin of the first afternoon nagging at him, he would have thought it one of the loveliest places he had catalogued all autumn. But he did have it nagging at him. And so, as he walked, he watched, and the second day gave him, one after another, the small facts that did not fit, and he wrote every one of them down without yet letting them add up, that the snow on the trace was still, on his second day, untracked but for his own boots of the day before, that in a full day no one in the hollow, not the Vearns, not anyone, had walked anywhere on the only path, that the two farther cabins, when he reached them, were empty in the same seasoned, tended, lately abandoned way as the first, wood split and stacked, one with a churn still standing full of what had long since gone to a dried gray cake, as though the household had walked out between one chore and the next, and that in the second of them the table was laid, set for a meal. 4 tin plates, 4 spoons, a serving bowl in the center with a wooden ladle standing in it, all of it laid out neat and waiting, and furred now with 30 years of dust, a supper set for a family that had risen from its chairs and gone out the door and never, ever come back to eat it. Renner stood in that cold room over that laid and dusted table for a long time. He wrote about it that evening more than he wrote about anything else that day. A table laid for 4, he wrote, and never cleared, and never eaten, and the dust lying on the food, as though they were called away sudden, all together, in the middle of sitting down to supper. But there is no sign of trouble, no overturned chair, no thing broken. They set the table, and then they simply were not here any more. I do not like this room. I catalogued it, and I came away, and I find I do not want to go back into it, and I cannot say why, except that a table laid for a supper no one ever came to eat is, I think, the loneliest object I have ever stood in a room with. The loneliest object I have ever stood in a room with. He was closer to the truth of the whole hollow, standing over that dusty supper, than he knew, for the hollow, as he would learn, is exactly that. A table laid forever. For a meal the living are never quite meant to eat, by hands that cannot stop laying it. Now I need to tell you about the other households, because Renner's job was to count them, and because the counting is where the ground first opened under him. Remember the figures. 4 households, 31 people as of 1880. Renner had found, by the end of his first full day of work, that would be the 25th, his second day in the hollow, that of the 4 dwellings. One was the empty cabin with the apples, one was the Vearns, and the other 2 were farther up the hollow, and both of those were empty as well, not ruined. Empty in the same particular way as the first. Sound roofs, split wood, doors shut, and in one of them a table laid for a meal that had never been eaten, the tin plates set out, a wooden spoon in a bowl of something long since dried to a black rind. 3 empty houses and 1 full one, and in the full one 3 people. 3 where the tax rolls and the census had led him to expect something closer to 30. Renner sat down that second evening, the 25th, and did his arithmetic, and his arithmetic did not work, and he wrote it out plainly, and I'm going to give it to you plainly, because the plainness is the horror. 31 people in 1880, 3 people in 1891, that is 28 people to account for. Some, surely, had simply left hollows emptied out all through those years, young people going to the mines or the mills or the West, and a family here or a family there, loading a wagon and rolling out and never coming back. That was ordinary. That was expected. If the 28 had left, there'd be nothing here but a sad, familiar story of a dying hollow, and Renner could write "removed" beside their names and go home. So he asked. That second night, over another generous supper he ate mostly alone, while the Vearns watched and Prudence hummed low by the fire, he asked Amos Vearn, the elder brother, what had become of all the others. Where had the Sorrel Hollow families gone? And Amos Vearn smiled his warm, patient, expecting smile, and he said Renner recorded it word for word. Oh, they're all still here. Nobody leaves the notch. The notch keeps its own. And then he passed Renner the dish of stewed apples and pressed him to have more, and would say nothing else about it, and the sister hummed by the fire, and outside the early dark came down the western ridge and filled the hollow up like water filling a cup, and Elias Renner sat in the one warm room in a valley full of empty houses and ate his apples and did not yet run, though something in him, he wrote this later in the last notebook. Looking back, something in him that second night stood up quietly and began, for the first time, to be afraid. Nobody leaves the notch. The notch keeps its own. I want to stay on that arithmetic a moment, because it is the coldest kind of horror there is. The horror you can do on paper, with a pencil, in a neat hand, by lamplight. And because it is the horror Renner was uniquely built to feel. 31 in 1880, 3 in 1891, and Amos Vearn saying, with a warm smile, "Oh, they're all still here." A lesser man, or a man in a different trade, might have heard that as a figure of speech, a bit of hill country fatalism, the kind of thing a stubborn old family says about a place they'll die in. But Renner was a counter. Renner had spent that very day walking a hollow that should have held 31 souls and finding 3 living Vearns and 3 empty houses and no tracks in the snow. And when Amos Vearn said they're all still here, Renner's counting mind did the only thing it knew how to do, which was to take the man at his exact word and follow the arithmetic where it led. If they were all still here, all 31 and only 3 were at the table, and 3 houses stood empty and tended with fresh apples and laid suppers and banked beds. Then where were the other 28? Still here, the man said, not gone. Not dead and buried in the little hollow churchyard Renner had catalogued that morning, whose stones stopped, he'd noticed, in the early 1860s, as though after a certain year the hollow had stopped burying its dead, stopped needing to. Still here. And Renner sat by that fire and felt the arithmetic close around him like cold water, because there is only one way for 28 people to be still here, and not at the table, and not in the ground. And he did not yet have the words for it, would not have them until he read the Widow Sallow's book 3 days later. But he had the shape of it, the arithmetic of it, the sense of sitting in a warm room in a valley that was far, far more crowded than it looked, that was, in fact, full, that had been full the whole time, 31 souls worth of full, and that the fullness was all around him, in the empty houses and the untracked snow and the 2 straight trees, watching, and that he had walked into the middle of it with a pencil and a ledger to count it, and that it had been waiting a long time to be counted by someone it could keep. That is the thing about a counting mind in a place like Sorrel Hollow. It cannot unknow a sum. Renner could have walked out of that hollow the next morning and lived, and he would still, every day of his life, have been a man who once did an arithmetic by a fire and got an answer that should not have an answer, and knew, in the getting of it, that he was outnumbered 28-1 in a valley that smiled. I told you the small wrongnesses would accumulate, and that the art of it is how small they are. Let me give you the 3rd day, the 26th, because the 3rd day is when Renner, the careful man, the man who calibrated his own paces, began to catch the hollow in small lies about itself. Measurable ones, the kind a surveyor catches and could not explain them, and wrote them down. The first thing was the tree line. Renner, working his way up the western ridge that morning to sketch the hollow from above for his report, noticed that the line where the bare hardwoods gave way to the dark evergreens along the ridge was too clean, too straight. In nature, a tree line like that is ragged. It follows the soil and the water and the wind. It wanders. It makes no straight edges because nature does not care for straight edges. But the hemlock line along both ridges of Sorrel Hollow Renner saw, dead straight, as level and true as if it had been drawn with a rule and a string, and exactly he measured it later, by eye against the far ridge, the same height on both sides, as if something had decided, at a certain elevation, that the hollow ended and had drawn a line, and the trees on the wrong side of the line had simply, quietly agreed. He stood on the ridge and looked at that impossible clean edge running away north and south into the winter haze, and he wrote in his notebook a single sentence, and the sentence has no explanation after it, which for Renner is itself a kind of scream. He wrote, "The hemlock line is ruled straight for the whole length of the hollow. I do not know how this can be. I do not know how this can be." Sit with that a moment. A grown man, a trained man, a dry and skeptical man, standing on a snowy ridge in the thin winter light, looking at a line of trees that should not be able to be that straight, and writing, in the same hand he used for the price of a coffin, "I do not know how this can be." That's the sound of the ground going thin under a person, not a scream. A flat sentence with no explanation after it. And I have to leave him there on the ridge for just a moment, because there is more, much more, and we have days to go, and I don't want you to think, when the worst things come, that they came out of nowhere. They didn't. They came out of a straight line of trees, and a bowl of stewed apples, and a woman humming low by a fire in a way that put a lonely man in mind of his dead wife. That's where the horror lives, not in the dark, in the almost right. Keep listening. I'll tell you what he found when he came down off that ridge, and what was waiting laid out on the porch of the Vearns' cabin when he got back, and why, on the night of the 26th, His third night in the hollow. Elias Renner barred the door of the loft for the first time, and Wyatt did not help. Because here is what was on the porch. But before the porch, coming down off that ridge, the hollow gave him one more thing to carry. And it is the small kind of wrong that I find lives in the body longest. As he came down through the bare hardwoods toward the bottom, following his own morning tracks back up, for he had learned already that quickly to walk in his own prints where he could, he came to a place where his outgoing tracks passed a particular fallen log, a big old wind-thrown oak, he remembered, clambering over on the way up, and his tracks went up to the log, and over it he could see where his boot had scuffed the snow off the top of it that morning, and down the far side and on. Except that now, in the afternoon, the log was on the wrong side of the trail. He was certain of it. That morning, the log had lain across his path so that he climbed it left to right. Now, coming down, following the very same line of his own prints, the log lay so that the scuff mark his boot had left on top of it that morning was on the underside, facing the ground. Impossible, unless the whole log had been turned over in the hours between, a log too big for two men to turn, or unless, and this is the thought that came to him, and that he wrote down and could not get rid of, unless the hollow had, in some small idle way, while his back was turned, rearranged itself behind him, shifted one log the way you might absently move a chair you'd bumped, not for any reason, not to trap him, just because in that place the arrangement of things was not fixed the way it is fixed in the thick and ordinary world, and a log might be one way in the morning and another way by dark, and the only person who would ever notice was a surveyor who measured everything and trusted his own tracks. He stood at that log a long time in the failing light. Then he climbed over it, the scuff mark on the underside. He made himself touch it. It was his. It was real. And he went on down, faster now, not measuring any more, and he did not look behind him, because he had begun to understand that in Sorrel Hollow the danger was not only what was ahead of you in the dark, but what quietly changed behind you in the light, and that a place that could turn a log could turn anything, and that the one thing you must not do, the one thing, was give it your full and trusting attention. The way you must not, in certain dreams, look too long at the face of the person you know is not who they are pretending to be. When Renner came down off the western ridge in the failing light of the 26th, cold and unsettled and turning over that ruled line of trees in his mind, he found the three Vearns waiting for him on the porch again, smiling their expecting smile, and laid out on the boards of the porch floor in front of them, arranged with care, was his own gear, his pack, his instruments, his 3 notebooks, everything he had brought into the hollow, everything he had left in the loft that morning, taken out and set in a neat row on the porch, as though this was his thought, and he wrote it as though for his departure, as though someone had packed him to leave. And Amos Vearn, still smiling, said, "We thought you'd want your things by you, brother, in case you had to go quick. In case you had to go quick." And Renner, who had told no one he was thinking of leaving, who had not, in fact, yet decided to leave, felt the cold come up through the soles of his boots, and he thanked them, because what else do you do? And he carried his things back up to the loft himself. And that night, for the first time, he dragged the heavy cedar chest across the loft floor and set it against the door, and he lay in the dark listening, and a little after what he judged to be midnight, the humming started. Not in the house, outside, below the loft window, low and tuneless, and barely a sound at all, the humming he'd heard by the fire, the humming that put him in mind of Marta, except now it was outside, in the snow, in the dark, at the foot of the wall, and it was climbing. I want to be precise about what Renner heard that third night, because he was precise about it, and because the precision is the thing that will not let you dismiss it. He did not write that he heard a ghost. He did not write that he heard a monster. He wrote that he heard a sound he recognized, coming from a place it could not be, doing a thing it should not be able to do. Those are three separate horrors. And he laid them out in order, in the dark, with a cedar chest against the door. The sound he recognized was the humming Prudence's humming, the low, tuneless thread of it he'd heard by the fire 2 nights running, the sound that put him in mind of Marta. The place it could not be was outside and below the loft window, at the base of the cabin wall, on the north side, where there was no door, no porch, no way up, only 6 inches of untracked snow against the foundation stones. And the thing it should not be able to do was climb, because the humming, Renner wrote, was rising, slowly, steadily, starting at the level of the foundation and rising up the wall, foot by foot, toward the loft window, as though whoever was humming were being lifted straight up the outside of the cabin in the dark, hand over hand, without a ladder, without a sound of climbing, no scrape, no grunt, no boots on logs, only the humming, rising, until it was level with the window, a foot from his face on the other side of the shutter, and then it stopped, and a voice low and warm and unaccountably kind, the voice of the sister, Prudence Vearn, said, through the shutter in the dark, "You don't have to be up there all alone, brother. It's warmer down here. Come down." Renner did not answer. Remember the second warning. Do not answer it. Do not go to the window for it. Do not open the door, not if it calls you by name, not if it uses a voice you know, not if it weeps. He lay still in the dark with his heart going, and he did not answer. And after a while he did not know how long. His careful notebook, for once, does not give the minutes, and the absence of the number is its own kind of testimony. After a while, the humming started again and began, slowly, to descend, back down the outside of the wall, foot by foot to the foundation, and then it was on the ground, and then it went away around the corner of the cabin toward the porch. And then it was quiet. And in the morning, the 27th, when Renner came down at last from the loft, gray-faced and unslept, the 3 Vearns were at the table, and there was breakfast laid, and Prudence Vearn sat by the fire, with her hands folded in her lap, and she was humming, low and tuneless, the same as ever, and she smiled at him when he came down and said, "You slept poorly, brother. This hollow's hard on strangers, the first while. It gets easier. It gets easier." And there was not, when Renner went out and walked around to the north side of the cabin in the daylight and made himself look, there was not a single footprint in the snow beneath the loft window. Not one. 6 inches of clean, unbroken white against the foundation stones, and above it the blank wall and the shuttered window, and no way in the world that anyone had stood there in the night and hummed a lonely man toward the sill. You see the shape of it now, I think. You see what kind of thing it is. But Renner didn't. Not fully. Not yet. And I don't want to hand you the answer whole when the whole terror of it for him was how slowly it came. The 4th day, the 27th, is a day I want to give you slowly and in full, because it is the day the wrongness stopped being a matter of things, a straight tree line, a barn, a bowl of apples, and started being a matter of the world itself not behaving, and because it is the day Renner began to keep 2 sets of notes, the ordinary census notes in the front of his book, and, in the back, upside down, so that the 2 accounts would meet in the middle, a second private ledger of the things he could not explain. He titled that second account, in his dry hand, Discrepancies. By the 9th day, the discrepancies would fill more pages than the census. He started it on the 4th day, with the lanterns. Here is the thing with the lanterns, and I have turned it over many times, and I cannot make it be anything but what he said it was. On the evening of the 27th, Renner sat at the Vearns' table after another supper. He ate alone under their warm, watching eyes, and he was making his notes by the light of 3 lamps, his own small candle lantern, and 2 oil lamps of the Vearns' one on the table and one on the shelf by the hearth, all three burning steady in a room with the door shut and the shutters closed, and no draught, none. He was certain of it. He was a man who noticed draughts, and as he wrote, all three flames, at the same instant, dropped. Not blown, not guttered. Dropped dim together, smoothly, to perhaps half their height. The way a single flame dims when you turn down a single wick, except no hand had touched any wick, and there were three of them, three separate flames in three separate reservoirs of oil and wax, and they went down together as though they were not three flames at all, but one flame wearing three bodies. One thing pretending to be three, dimming all at once, because behind the pretense there was only the one of it. And they held there, low, together, for a slow count of, he counted for a slow count of 9, and then, together, smoothly, they came back up. And the three Vearns at the edge of the room did not react at all, did not glance at the lamps, did not pause in their warm, murmured talk. Because for them, it was nothing. It was ordinary. It was the hollow breathing, and Renner understood in that moment, watching them not react, that whatever wore the Vearns and whatever dimmed the lamps were the same thing, and that he was sitting inside it, at its table, eating its apples, a small warm morsel of living man held in the mouth of something that was, just then, idly, without malice, counting to 9 with the flames of 3 lamps. He wrote it in the back of the book, upside down, the first discrepancy. The lamps dimmed together, no draught, held to a count of 9, rose together. The Vearns took no notice. I do not think they can any longer see it. I think when it takes you, you stop being able to see it, and that is the worst of what it does, worse than the taking. It does not only wear you, it blinds you to itself, so that you smile at the stranger and press the apples on him, and do not know at all, that you are the bait in a warm room. I think when it takes you, you stop being able to see it. Hold that. It is the whole tragedy of the Vearns in one line, and it is the thing Renner feared most for himself, more than dying, not that the hollow would kill him, but that it would keep him, and blind him, and set him smiling on a porch to wave the next lonely stranger in for 30 more years, and that he would not even know. That was the 4th evening. The 4th afternoon, before it, had given him the footprints, and the footprints are worse than the lamps, because you can tell yourself a lamp is a draught you didn't feel, but you cannot tell yourself anything about the footprints. Renner had spent the daylight of the 27th doing his proper work, walking the hollow, and in the course of it he had crossed a stretch of open snow between the second empty cabin and the creek, fresh snow, untracked, and he had left his own trail across it, plain, a single line of a man's boots going one way, and an hour later, coming back, he crossed the same open stretch, and his own outgoing trail was still there, exactly as he'd left it, one line of boots going away, and beside it now, coming back, was a second line of tracks. His tracks. The same boots, the same tread, the same nailing pattern he could read like his own name, returning along the path he had not yet returned along, made by his own boots, except, and here is the thing he measured, on his knees in the snow, with the light going, his own ruler out, because he could not make himself believe it without the number, except that the returning stride was longer. His own stride, but longer, 4 inches longer, boot to boot, than any stride he had ever taken or could take, as though something had put on his tracks the way it put on the Vearns' faces and warned them back along his path ahead of him, and walked in his own returning footprints toward the cabin, where he slept, but taller than he was, or with legs that bent some way his did not, striding along in his boots 4 inches at a time too far, patient, unhurried, going home. And when Renner looked up from the ruler, following that too long trail of his own returning tracks with his eyes, it led straight to the Vearns' cabin, to the porch, to the door, and stopped there, At the threshold he slept behind, as though whatever wore his boots had walked up to his own door and stood and looked at it, and gone no farther, because it could go no farther, because the door was the one thing it could not pass unless he opened it, and he had not yet, and so it had simply come as far as the door in his own stolen stride, and stopped, and waited, the way it waited everywhere in that hollow, at every threshold, patient as the snow. He did not sleep much on the fourth night. He lay in the loft with the cedar chest against the door, and he listened, and this time the humming did not climb the wall, the hollow, I think, having felt him brace for that, having felt him ready with the second warning in his mind, do not go to the window, chose not to spend the humming on a night he was ready for, chose instead to simply let him lie there and listen to nothing, and wear himself thin on the waiting, which is a torment the hollow understood as well as any torturer ever has. But once, deep in the night, he heard, directly below the loft, in the front room of the cabin where the three Vearns did not sleep because they did not need to sleep, he heard the sound of a chair being drawn back from the table, and set down again, and drawn back, and set down, slow, patient, over and over, for what he judged to be an hour, the small, dry creak of old wood, taking a weight and giving it up, taking a weight and giving it up, and he did not understand it then, and it was only later, in the clearing, when he saw the gray kitchen chair worn silver by long sitting at the center of the snowless circle, that he understood what he had been listening to below him in the dark, the sound of something practicing sitting down at a table, learning, against the night when it might get a living man to sit across from it at last, the shape of the thing it had watched the living do 10,000 times and had never once been able to do, because it had no hunger. And the table is for the hungry, and it was learning anyway, drawing the chair back and setting it down, back and down, all through the fourth night, an hour of a monster teaching itself to pull up a chair. And in the morning, the fifth morning, the 28th Renner went up the hollow to the third empty cabin, the sallow place, the one farthest up the trace, because it was the last dwelling he had not fully catalogued, and because, he wrote, he could not stand another hour in the warm room with the smiling three, and he needed daylight and distance and work. And in the sallow place, in a trunk under the laid table where a meal had dried to a black rind 30 years before, he found the ledger. And the ledger is where this story stops being only Renner's, and becomes older and worse and stranger than a lonely man and a humming in the dark. So let me give you the ledger. But first, if you've come this far with me, into the fifth day and the found book and the north wall with no tracks under it, then you already know this isn't the kind of story that lets go once it has you. That's what the whole collection is. What the snow kept, 12 of them. The link's down below, and if this is the one that got its hook in, the other 11 are waiting. And do me that small thing again, if you would. Tell me in the comments what time it is where you are right now, this minute, listening to this. I'm curious how much of this is being heard in the dark, and how much in the daylight where it's safer. Then come back to the hollow with me, because Renner's about to open a dead woman's book, and I don't want you to miss a word of what she wrote. The third cabin, the one farthest up the hollow, had belonged. Renner worked this out from the ledger itself, and from a family Bible he found, in the same trunk, to a family named Sallow, which is a real name, an old border name, though I grant you it sounds invented for the occasion, a family named Sallow in a hollow full of empty houses. The head of that household had been a woman, Rachel Sallow, widow, who by the dates in the Bible had been born in 1831, and had come into Sorrel Hollow as a young bride in the early 1850s, and had outlived her husband and, it seems, most of her children. And Rachel Sallow had kept a book. Not a diary. Exactly, she'd have thought, a diary of vanity. She'd kept it as a ledger, an account book, the front 2/3 of it given over to exactly the kind of dry domestic arithmetic you'd expect, the weight of the hog at slaughter, the price of nails, the yield of the corn, the debts owed and paid. And then, about 2/3 of the way through the book, the arithmetic stops and Rachel's sallow begins, in the same hand she'd used to record the weight of a hog, to keep account of something else, to keep account of the hollow. And I'm going to read you some of it, not all. It runs to many pages, but the parts that matter, and I want you to notice, as I do, that Rachel Sallow was, like Renner, a plain and unfanciful writer, a person who wrote down what was true, because writing it down was how she kept her grip on it. Two careful people, 30 years apart, in the same hollow, both reaching for the same pencil. That's not a coincidence. That's the hollow. It does that to people. It makes them want to write it down. I've come to think that's part of how it feeds. Here is the first of the strange entries in Rachel Sallow's book, and I'll modernize her spelling a little so it's easy to follow, but keep her words. She wrote, "This is the 3rd winter since my Thomas passed, and the hollow has begun to give him back to me, a little at a time, and I know I must not take him, though the wanting is a sickness in me. It starts with the sound of him." He would clear his throat a certain way before he spoke. All the years I knew him, and I have heard that throat clearing 4 nights now from the yard after dark. I have not gone out. My mother, God keep her, told me the rule when I was a girl and she was dying, and I will set it down here so it is not lost. The notch gives you back your dead, but what it gives back is not your dead. It is the notch wearing your dead, and it wears them to get the door open, and once the door is open, it does not give the person back. It takes the person that opened it and wears them next, for the next lonely soul who comes. That is how it fills. That is why the house is empty and the hollow never does. I'll let that sit for a second, because Renner did. He sat on the floor of that cold cabin, with the Widow Sallow's book open on his knees and the early dark coming down, and he read that the notch gives you back your dead, but what it gives back is the notch wearing your dead, and it wears them to get the door open, and he thought, of course, of a humming climbing the outside of a wall in the night, and a warm voice saying, "Come down, it's warmer down here," and a woman by the fire who hummed the way Marta hummed, and he understood, sitting there, at last and all at once, and far too late to be easy about it, exactly what the Vearns were. Not the 3 living Vearns of the tax roll of 1880, something wearing them, something that had gotten their door open, once, years ago, the same way, and taken them, and worn them, and was wearing them still, and had been smiling its warm, expecting smile at Elias Renner across a bowl of stewed apples for 5 days now, waiting, patient, counting, for his door to open too. The notch keeps its own. Nobody leaves the notch. Now you know what Amos Vearn meant. Now Renner knew. And Rachel Sallow, God bless her steady hand, did not stop at the mythology. She kept the account. She was a bookkeeper by nature the way Renner was, the way I suspect the hollow needs its keepers to be, and in the middle pages of that ledger she had set down, name by name and winter by winter, the history of Sorrel Hollow, as she had watched it empty around her over 40 years, and it is the most complete record of the hollow that exists, and Renner copied all of it, and I'm going to give you the shape of it, because it is the thing that turns the Vearns from a horror into a tragedy, and a tragedy is always worse. She had come into the hollow, she wrote, as a bride in the early 1850s, and in those days this is the thing that stops your breath. In those days Sorrel Hollow was full. It was an ordinary, thriving backcountry hollow, a dozen families, children, corn and hogs, and a little church house with a bell, weddings and buryings, and the whole ordinary human racket of a place where people live. She named them, the families, in her book, the Sallows, her own, and the Coombs, and the Ledbetters, and old man Prather, who ran the mill, and the Vearns, yes, the Vearns, an ordinary family among the others, a mother and a father and a whole clutch of children, of whom Amos and Isaiah and Prudence were the three youngest, born in the hollow in the 1850s, ordinary hollow children who grew up ordinary in an ordinary full valley. That is who the Vearns were, not monsters, children. Children who grew up in a hollow that nobody yet knew was thin, because in those years it had not yet begun to take, because, and this is Rachel Sallow's terrible small theory, set down in her plain hand, because thin ground, she wrote, is not always hungry. It sleeps, she wrote. The thinness is always there, but the hunger sleeps, sometimes for years, sometimes for a lifetime, and a whole generation can live and die on thin ground and never know, and think the old warnings foolishness, and let them be forgot. And then, one winter, for no cause anyone can see, it wakes, and it is so hungry from the sleeping, and it takes, and a full hollow goes empty in a life. It woke, she wrote. In the hard winter of 1861, the first winter of the Great War, when the young men were gone off to it, and the hollow was full of women and children, and the old, lonely, frightened, grieving early for men not yet even dead, a whole valley of unlatched doors. And it woke hungry, and it started. Old man Prather first, who had lost 2 sons to the war in a single month, and heard them, that winter, calling him from the mill race, and went out to them, and did not come back, and was seen after on his own porch, smiling, waving the neighbors over, warm as he had never been in life. Then the neighbors who went to him, then the Ledbetters, a whole family in a single week. The winter, the fever, and the hunger came together, and no one could tell any more which had taken whom. Winter by winter, Rachel Sallow set it down, the emptying of Sorrel Hollow, the way you'd keep the accounts of a farm going under. This family gone, that house dark, the church bell silent, because there was no one left with the heart to ring it, the trace growing over, the hollow eating its way through 40 years of her neighbors, while she, and she does not spare herself, she asks it plainly in the book while she stayed, and kept her hand off the latch, and lived, and wrote it down, and could not say, at the end, whether staying to keep the account had been a brave thing, or only a cowardly way of not being the one who left. The Vearns, she wrote, the 3 youngest Vearn children grown to middle age, were among the very last to go, taken in the winter of 1879, which is why the census of 1880 still listed them, listed all 31, because the census taker of 1880 had walked into a hollow that looked full, with smoke rising from occupied cabins and warm, smiling people on the porches who came out to meet him before he knocked, and had counted them, all 31, the living 3 and the 28 already taken and worn, and had written down 31 souls in Sorrel Hollow and gone home, never knowing he had taken the census of a graveyard that smiled. 31 souls, not one of them, by 1880, still its own. Rachel Sallow watched the 1880 man walk out alive the hollow, she noted, being full that year, and slow, and not needing him. And she wrote in her book that she had wanted to warn him and had not dared, because to warn him she would have had to go down to the trace and speak, and the hollow was between her and the trace, and she was by then so very tired, and so very close, herself, to the sound of Thomas clearing his throat in the yard. That is who was smiling at Elias Renner across the apples. Amos and Isaiah and Prudence Vearn, born in a full and living hollow in the 1850s, ordinary children of an ordinary place, who grew up and grew lonely, and were taken in the winter of 1879, and had been the hollow's welcoming face for 12 years by the time Renner walked up the trace, worn so long, by then so smooth and so complete, that they no longer knew, could no longer see, smiled and pressed the apples, and drew the chair back and forth in the night, and did not know. When Renner understood all this, sitting on the cold floor of the sallow place with the ledger open, the whole 40-year emptying of the hollow laid out in a dead woman's bookkeeping hand, he stopped. He wrote, and he wept, once, briefly, and not from fear, from pity. They were children here, he wrote, in the back of his book, upside down among the discrepancies. Prudence Vearn was a little girl in this hollow when it was full and the bell rang. The thing that hums at my wall in her voice was a little girl once, who grew up and lost someone and opened a door. I am not being hunted by a monster. I am being hunted by the ghost of somebody's loneliness, wearing somebody's little sister. God help her. God help all of them. God help me, for I am next in the book if I falter, and there is no one left in this hollow to write my name in it but myself. There is more in Rachel Sallow's book, and it gets worse, because it gets more specific, and specificity. I keep coming back to this. Specificity is where the dread lives. She kept account, in those back pages, of the rules, the way you'd keep account of debts, because she understood the hollow as a kind of creditor, something you owed, something that would collect. And I'm going to give you her rules the way she wrote them, because Renner copied them into his own notebook that very evening, in the cold, by candlelight. His hand, he noted this himself, a rare admission, his hand shaking, so that the letters came out strange, and because those rules are the ones he would live or die by in the 4 days he had left. Rachel Sallow's first rule: it counts to 9. From the day a stranger sets foot in the hollow, it counts. And on the 9th night it comes to the door in the shape it has been building all the days before, the shape it took from your own heart, and on the 9th night it does not hum, and it does not wait, it knocks, and it will use every voice you ever loved. And if you last the 9th night till the sun clears the eastern ridge, it must let you go, and it will be another year before it can count again. It counts to 9. There it is, Coy Aldis's first warning: be down out of the hollow before the 9th day, sitting in a dead woman's ledger 30 years before Aldis ever said it to Renner on a wagon seat. The whole hollow, passing the same warning hand to hand down the years, and every year another lonely soul who didn't listen. Rachel Sallow's second rule: it cannot come in unless you let it in. This is the whole of the law, and the only mercy in it. It cannot force the door, it cannot break the glass, it cannot lift the latch itself. It can only ask. It can beg, it can weep, it can wear your mother's face and your child's voice, it can tell you it is cold and dying on your very step, but it cannot come in unless your own hand opens the door. Every soul this hollow has taken opened the door themselves. Remember that when the weeping starts. You will want to. You will tell yourself it is only kindness to open the door to something weeping in the cold. That wanting is the hollow. That is its true voice. The humming, the knocking, the weeping, those are only the bait. The wanting is the hook, and it is inside you, and it was inside you before you ever came here, and the hollow only found it. The wanting is the hook, and it is inside you, and it was inside you before you ever came here. I don't know that I've ever read a truer sentence about grief, in a ghost story or anywhere else. The hollow doesn't make you want the dead back. The wanting is already there. The hollow just knows. It finds the door that's already unlatched in you, and it stands outside it and it waits. And Rachel Sallow's third rule, the last one, and the one that breaks off, because I told you at the start that the found document ends mid-warning, right before the previous victim's disappearance, and it does. It does exactly that. Her third rule begins: if you must survive the 9th night, then you must have a way to keep your own hand off the latch, for your own hand will not be on your side. I count. When it starts, I count aloud, the fence posts, 1 to 40 and back, over and over. Because the counting is a thing my own voice does that is only mine, that the hollow has no shape for, And as long as I am counting, I am not listening. And as long as I am not listening, my hand stays off the, and that's where it stops. Mid-sentence. Mid-word, almost off the, and then nothing. The rest of the page blank, and the rest of the book blank, page after cold blank page, and Renner turned every one of them looking for the end of the sentence, and there was no end. Rachel Sallow set down her rule for keeping her hand off the latch, and in the very act of writing it, something interrupted her. On some 9th night in some year Renner could not fix, and she put down her pencil, and she never picked it up again, and the Hollows tax roll lost another name. And 30 years later, a census taker sat on the floor of her empty house, holding the unfinished sentence in his shaking hands while the dark came down. Off the what? Off the latch. She meant off the latch. We know she meant off the latch, but she didn't finish it. Something got the door open, and I want you to notice, Renner noticed, he wrote it down. It's one of the most frightening single observations in the whole record. I want you to notice that Rachel Sallow's counting rule had a flaw, and she'd told us the flaw herself 2 rules earlier without knowing it. And the flaw is this: the counting keeps your hand off the latch only as long as you keep counting, and no one can count forever. A whole night is a very long time, and the Hollow. The Hollow is patient, and the Hollow has all night, and the Hollow only needs you to stop once, for one number, to listen to one sound, to say back one word, and the counting had kept Rachel Sallow's hand off the latch for how many 9th nights? 5, 10, until the one night it didn't, until the one number she skipped to listen to a throat cleared a certain way in the yard. That's the flaw in the ritual. That's the flaw in every ritual like it. It works right up until the moment it has to work most, and then it is only you, and your own wanting, and a latch in the dark. Renner copied it all. Then he closed Rachel Sallow's book, and he sat in the dark of her empty house. He'd let the candle burn down, reading, and he made himself walk back down the hollow to the Vearns' cabin in full dark, which he had not done before. And I want to tell you what that walk was like, because he told us, and because it's the 5th night, and the counting has begun to change him already. The trace between the Sallow place and the Vearn place ran maybe half a mile down the hollow along the creek, and Renner walked it in the dark with a candle lantern that the wind kept threatening, and on both sides of him the empty hollow stood and watched, and he found he wrote this, that he had begun, without deciding to count his own paces aloud. 1, 2, 3, the way he'd calibrated them years ago, 1,000 to the half-mile, and the counting steadied him, and then, about halfway down, at the edge of the lantern light, he saw someone standing off the trace among the bare trees, not moving, facing him, and he stopped counting to look, and the instant he stopped counting, the figure took a step toward him, and he understood, in his body, before his mind caught up, and he started counting again, loud, 4, 5, 6, and the figure stopped. He walked the rest of the way to the Vearns' counting, every pace at the top of his lungs, like a madman in the dark, and whatever stood among the trees kept pace with him, just at the edge of the light, moving when he faltered, stopping when he counted. And I want to give you the one detail of that walk that Renner set down, and then he wrote, wished he had not let himself notice, because once noticed, it could not be unnoticed. The figure at the edge of the light was the right height and the right shape, and it moved the way she moved. He never let himself look at it directly. He had learned that much. Do not go to the window. Do not look too long. But a lantern throws its light in a circle, and a thing that keeps to the very edge of that circle is always half in the corner of your eye, whether you will it or not, and in the corner of his eye, for half a mile in the dark, Elias Renner had the shape of his dead wife pacing him through the trees, matching his stride, waiting at the edge of the light for him to stop counting and turn and look and know her. And he did not stop, and he did not turn, and he counted, and he wept while he counted, which he admitted, the only time in the record he admits to weeping from anything but pity. And he said the counting and the weeping came out of him together, one long broken column of numbers with the grief running down through it, 4, 5, 6, all the way down the trace, a man counting and crying in the dark with his dead wife's shape, keeping pace just past the lantern's reach. And that, he wrote, that was the night he understood in his body, not his head, what the old woman would tell him 2 days later on the ridge, that the counting was only a wall, and that behind the wall the wanting went on exactly as strong as ever, that he could hold the wall all night and still be, behind it, a man crying for his wife, and half ready to turn and go to her, and that the wall was not the answer. The wall was just the thing that kept him alive long enough to find the answer, and he did not have the answer yet, and he had 4 days left to find it. When he finally reached the Vearns' porch, the three of them were standing on it in the dark, smiling, waiting, and Amos Vearn said, "You've been to the Sallow house? You've read her book? Good. Then you know. It's easier when you know. It's a comfort, knowing. Come in, brother. Come in out of the cold. Come in out of the cold. 4 days left." And now Renner knew exactly what they were, and exactly what the counting was for, and exactly how it would fail, because a dead woman had told him, in a book that stopped mid-word, and knowing, it turned out, was not the comfort Amos Vearn promised. Knowing was worse, because now, when the humming climbed the wall that night, the 5th night, and the warm voice at the shutter said, "Come down, brother, it's warmer down here now." Renner knew whose warmth it was borrowing, and why, and what it would cost, and he lay in the loft with the cedar chest against the door, and he counted 1 to 40 and back. The fence posts he could not even see, in the voice of a man who has read the last sentence a person like him ever wrote, and understood that it stopped where it stopped for a reason. I need to tell you about the 6th day, and about the barn, because on the 6th day Renner made a decision that a wiser or a more cowardly man would not have made, and it is the decision that takes us to the old woman on the ridge, the one person left alive in that whole country who could tell him not just the rules, which he now had, but the reason for them, the shape of the thing behind the rules. He decided, on the morning of the 6th day, that he was not going to spend 3 more nights simply enduring, counting in the dark, waiting for the 9th night to come for him. He was going to try to understand it. He was going to go looking, and a surveyor, when he goes looking, measures. So Renner spent the 6th day, the 29th of November, measuring the Vearns' cabin, inside and out, and comparing it to the empty cabins, and to the widow Sallow's house. And it is in that measuring that he found the thing about the barn, the wrongness that is, to my mind, the single most unsettling small detail in the whole account, worse than the humming, worse than the figure in the trees, because it is so quiet, and so exact, and so impossible. The Vearns had a barn, a small one, behind the cabin, on the north side, an old, squared log barn with a shake roof, and Renner had walked past it a dozen times without much noticing it. On the 6th day he measured it, because he was measuring everything, and he found that the barn was not square. Not in the ordinary way that old buildings sag and lean. It was out of square in a way that was consistent and deliberate, and he came to realize as he checked and rechecked his figures with a growing cold in his chest, mathematically impossible for a building actually made of straight logs. Every corner of the barn was very slightly more than a right angle, every single corner, and the sum of the corners of a 4-cornered building, as any schoolchild knows and as Renner the surveyor knew in his marrow, must come to 360 degrees, no more and no less, because that is what a rectangle is. But the 4 corners of the Vearns' barn, measured with his own instruments 3 times, came to more than that, came to something a rectangle cannot come to, as though the barn enclosed a little more space than its walls should be able to hold, as though, on the inside, it were very slightly larger than it was on the outside, and not by an honest amount, not by a measuring error, but by exactly the amount that a place would be off by if it were not quite entirely in the same world as the man measuring it. He wrote, that evening, "The barn's corners sum to more than a rectangle allows. I have checked 3 times. I do not know how this can be. I do not know how this can be." The second time he wrote that sentence. The first was the ruled line of trees. And I'll tell you now that he would write it a third time, on the 9th night, about a thing far worse than a barn, but that's for later. But it was not enough for Renner to stand outside the barn. A man who cannot leave a thing unmeasured cannot leave a barn whose corners do not add up standing behind him unopened, and so, against every instinct that was worth anything, in the failing light of the 6th day, Elias Renner went inside the barn. And I have to tell you what he found there, because it is a small thing and a quiet thing, and it is, in a certain way, the most frightening single object in this whole account, more than the chair, more than the groove, precisely because it is so domestic, so nearly tender, and so wrong. The inside of the barn was, as his instruments had promised him, a little larger than the outside. He could not have told you that by standing in it, the way you cannot tell you are on a great slow curve of the earth by standing in a field. But he had the numbers, and the numbers said the inside held more than the outside could give. And being inside a space that was larger than its own walls is a thing the body knows, even when the eye cannot catch it. A low, wrong hum in the inner ear. A sense of the walls being farther than your hands say they are. It was dim and dry, and empty of animals. Of course it was empty of animals. Nothing living had been kept in that hollow in 30 years. And it was clean, swept, the dirt floor raked, and along one wall there were stalls, and the stalls were the wrong thing. Because the stalls were made up, bedded, each one deep in clean straw, fresh straw, straw with no dust on it, banked and shaped the way you bank a stall for a beast you love, for a milk cow and calf, for a favorite mare, a dozen stalls, all bedded soft and deep and fresh and empty, in a barn behind a house where nothing had lived in 30 years, kept ready, kept waiting, made up every day, he understood, made up new every single day by hands that no longer knew why they did it, for the return of animals that were 30 years dead, or for the arrival of something that had never come, or, and this is the reading that closed his throat, kept made up the way a certain kind of grief keeps a dead child's room, dusted and aired, and the bed turned down, for years, for decades, against a homecoming that the griever knows in daylight will never come and cannot, in the dark, stop preparing for. The barn was the hollow's grief made into a chore. 12 soft empty beds, banked fresh every day, waiting. And in the last stall, the farthest from the door, the straw was pressed down, shaped, as though something had lain in it. Recently, something about the size of a person, curled, the hollow of it still holding the shape, in a barn where nothing living had lain in 30 years, in the last stall, in the dark, and Renner stood looking at that pressed and person-shaped hollow in the clean straw, and he did not go closer, and he did not measure it. The only thing in 9 days he chose not to measure, and he turned and walked out of the barn into the honest cold, and he did not go back. He wrote in the discrepancies that night. The stalls are bedded fresh, all 12, every day, for animals 30 years gone. The last one has been lain in. I did not measure the shape. Some measurements a man should not take. I begin to think the whole hollow is one long act of a grief that cannot stop keeping. House for the dead, the apples strung, the table laid, the beds banked, the chair drawn back and forth in the night. And that this is not incidental to the horror, but is the horror entire. That what waits here is not evil so much as it is unappeasable love. with nothing left to love, going through the motions of tending forever, and reaching out, now and again, for anything warm enough to tend. I am, to it, something warm enough to tend. That is the whole of what I am to it. It does not want to hurt me. It wants to keep me, and bank me in fresh straw, and draw the chair back for me, and never, never let me go cold. I think that is worse. I am sure that is worse. That was the 6th day. The 6th night was the worst before the 9th, and I will give it to you plainly, because Renner did, and because it is the night his own ritual, the counting, the only wall he had first showed him its flaw, the same flaw the widow Sallow's book had shown, the flaw that no wall can be held all night. He lay in the loft with the chest against the door, and near midnight the humming came. But it did not climb the wall this time. It came from inside the cabin, from the front room directly below him, and it was joined, now, by the sound he had heard the night before and not understood the chair, drawn back and set down, back and down, and by a third sound, new, the worst yet, the sound of the table being laid, tin plates set out, one by one, on the boards below him, the scrape of a bench, the small homely clink and clatter of a household setting down to supper, directly beneath him, in a cabin he knew to be full of dust and empty of the living, at midnight, with the humming under it all, low, and held a beat too long. They were laying a place. He knew, lying there, that they were laying a place for him. That below him in the dark the taken Vearns were setting the table for a supper he was meant to come down to, drawing back a chair that was meant to be his, and that all he had to do to end the terrible homely patience of that sound was go down the ladder and sit in it. And he began to count 1 to 40 and back, to wall it out, and he found, on the 6th night, that the counting had begun to fail in a way it had not before, because he was so tired. 6 nights of little sleep, 6 days of measuring impossibilities, and the numbers, which had steadied him all week, began to slip, to blur, to come out of order. 40, 39, 30, and he would lose his place. And in the gap where the number should have been, he would hear the plates going down below. Clink, clink, so warm, so patient, a place being laid for a cold and lonely man, and he would feel his own body want to rise, and he would grab the count back, wrenching it, 29, 28, and hold and lose it and grab it back, all night. That is the flaw. The wall is only as strong as the arm that holds it, and the arm gets tired, and the hollow never does. Renner made it to morning on the 6th night, but only just, and he wrote at dawn, in a hand gone nearly to pieces, "The counting is not enough. I have found the bottom of it. It works until I am too tired to work it. And one more night like this, and I will be too tired, and I will go down to the table they are laying for me, and I will sit in the chair, and I will be so glad, for one moment, to be warm and not alone, and that moment will be the last thing I ever am. I cannot do 3 more nights of this on numbers alone. I need more than a wall. I need a reason not to want the door open, and counting has never once given me that. Counting only keeps my hands busy while the wanting grows. Tomorrow I climb the ridge. There is an old woman above the thin ground who has never been taken. If anyone alive knows the thing behind the rule, it is her. I have measured this hollow to the edge of my reason and found only that it is bottomless. I need, now, not to measure, but to be told. God let her be real. God let her be home. And so, on the 7th morning, hollow-eyed and half unstrung and out of walls, Elias Renner did the thing he should have done on the first day. He stopped measuring, and he went to find the one person in that whole country who could tell him not the size of the horror, but the shape of the mercy inside it. He climbed the eastern ridge, out of the ruled hollow, up past the 2 straight line of hemlocks, to the one house he'd been told still held a living soul who had never been taken the house of the old woman the people at the county called, when they called her anything, the keeper of the notch. The old woman's house stood above the ruled line of trees, and I want you to hold on to that, because it turns out to be the whole geography of the thing. Below the line of hemlocks, in the bowl of the hollow, you were in the notch, and the notch counted you and watched you and wore your dead. Above the line, up on the shoulder of the eastern ridge, where the hemlocks gave way to open rock and wind, you were out of it. The old woman had built her house, or her people had, generations back deliberately, exactly 20 feet above that ruled tree line, on the first ground that did not belong to the hollow. She lived, in the most literal sense, on the edge of it. She had spent her whole life on the lip of the thing, looking down into it, keeping the one account that mattered. That was what a keeper was. Renner would learn all this in the space of a single afternoon, the 7th day, the 30th of November, and it is the clearest and the strangest few hours in the entire record. Her name was Orpha Meese. She was, by her own reckoning, past 80. She did not know the exact year of her birth, which tells you something about how far back and how far out her people had lived. She was small and dry and quick, Renner wrote, with hands that never stopped moving carding wool the whole time they spoke, her fingers going by themselves, while her pale eyes stayed on him, and she was not surprised to see him. Of course, she was not surprised. She had seen him come up the ridge. She had, she told him, been watching the hollow the way she watched it every winter, waiting to see whether this year's stranger would climb up out of it before the 9th night, or go down into it for good, and she'd been watching Renner's little lantern move around the bowl for 6 nights now, and she'd made up her mind he was one of the ones who'd go down, and she was, she said, glad to be wrong, for once, though it don't happen often. Glad to be wrong. Most of them, she meant, do not climb the ridge. Most of them stay in the warm room and eat the apples and open the door. I told you at the start that the wise local figure in a story like this inherited the role and never chose it, and Orpha Meese had, she told Renner, plainly, carding her wool, that she had not wanted to be the keeper, that no one ever wants it, that it comes to you the way a debt comes to you, from someone who dies and leaves it. Her own grandmother had kept the hollow before her, and had taught her the account of it as a girl, the way you'd teach a girl her letters, and had made her swear to stay and keep it after she was gone, because, and this is the first spare, folkloric thing Orpha Meese said, the first line that told Renner he was in the presence of a cosmology older than the tax rolls because, she said, some ground is thick, and most ground is thick, and you can live your whole life and die on thick ground and never know there's any other kind. But some ground is thin, and the notch is thin. It's the thinnest ground in this whole country, thin as the skin over your eye, and there's something on the other side of it that's hungry, and thin ground is where it can reach through. A keeper is just somebody who agrees to live by a thin place and count what goes in and out of it so the thin place don't get forgot. Because the danger ain't the thing on the other side. The danger is people forgetting the ground is thin, and building a house on it, and moving in, and being lonely there. The thing on the other side can't do nothing to you if you don't come and be lonely on top of it. But people always do. There's always lonely people, and there's always somebody to tell them there's cheap land in a pretty hollow, and they always come. Some ground is thick, and some ground is thin. Renner wrote it down, and I think it is worth stopping, here, in the warm of wherever you are, to notice what a merciful and terrible piece of theology that is. There's nothing evil in it, exactly. There's no devil in Orpha Meese's account, no curse, no sin being punished. There is only thin ground, and a hunger on the far side of it, and the one thing the hunger needs to reach through, which is a lonely human heart, standing on the thin place, wanting something back that the world has taken. The hollow isn't cruel. The hollow is just thin. Cruelty would almost be easier. You can hate cruelty. You cannot hate thin ground. You can only stay off it. Or, if you will not stay off it, you can learn the rules, and Orpheus, that seventh afternoon, gave Elias Renner the rules, the true and refined ones, the ones behind Rachel Sallow's rules, and they were not quite what the widow's book had said, and the difference is what kept Renner alive. Before she gave him the rules, though, Orpheus told him about the keepers, and I want to give you that, because it is the piece of the cosmology that Rachel Sallow's book did not have, the piece you can only get from the living lineage that has stood on the lip of the thing and watched it, generation after generation, and it deepens the whole horror by giving it a history longer than the county, longer than the country. There had always been a keeper, she said. Not always a Mies, the name changed, the family changed, the role passed sideways sometimes, to a niece, to a neighbor, to whoever was near and willing when the last one died, but always, as far back as anyone's grandmother's grandmother could hand the account down, there had been one house above the thin ground, and one person in it whose whole work was to watch the notch and keep the count, and remember, out loud, once a year, to whoever would listen, that the ground was thin. Before the white settlers, she said, there had been others who kept it, older people, whose word for the thing she did not know, but whose rule was the same rule, handed to her own people when they came, the way you hand a neighbor the key to a well you share. This ground is thin. Do not build in the bottom. Do not be lonely there after dark. And if a stranger goes down into it, watch and count to 9. And on the 10th morning, go and see who walks out. The county thinks I'm a witch, she told Renner, carding her wool, dry as ever. Or they think I'm a crazy old woman living up a ridge for spite. They're wrong both ways. I ain't got a lick of power. I can't lift a finger against that thing down there, and neither could my grandmother, and neither could hers. A keeper don't fight it. A keeper can't. All a keeper does is remember it and count it, and now and again save one not by magic, by telling, by being the one voice in the whole county that'll say the true thing out loud to a frightened stranger before he goes down, or, like you, after he's gone down and needs to know how to come back up. That's all the power there is against a thing like this. Memory. Somebody who refuses to let it be forgot. That's why it's so patient, and that's why it near always wins in the end. Because memory dies, child. People forget. A keeper dies with no one raised up to take the account, and a generation goes by, and the warnings turn into ghost stories, and the ghost stories turn into nothing, and some poor, lonely family reads about cheap, pretty land in a hollow with a creek, and moves down into the bottom, and that's the whole of how it feeds. It don't hunt. It waits to be forgot. Forgetting is the door it really wants open, and it's a bigger door than any latch, and it's the one I've spent 80 years leaning my whole body against. Forgetting is the door it really wants open. Renner underlined that too. I said there was only one underlining in 3 notebooks, and I was wrong to say it so simply. There were 2, and this was the first, and the one about not wanting it in was the second, and between them they are the whole of what Orpheus knew. The hollow wants 2 doors open, the small one, the latch, on the 9th night, for one man at a time, and the great one, forgetting, across the generations, for everyone, forever. And the second is the one that has nearly always been open, because people are people, and grief fades into stories, and stories fade into nothing, and who among us, warm and safe and modern, truly believes that some ground is thin? That is the hollow's long patience. It can afford to lose a Renner, now and again, to a stubborn old woman with a good memory. It knows the old women die, and the memories die, and the ground stays thin forever, and sooner or later, a generation, a century. It does not care, it does not count time the way we do. Sooner or later, everyone forgets, and the beds are banked fresh in the barn, and it waits," she told him. "Two, and this is the last of the cosmology, the coldest piece. And then I'll give you the rules," she told him, what was on the other side of the thin ground, as much as any keeper had ever been able to say, which was almost nothing, and the almost nothing is worse than a full description could ever be. "I don't know what it is," Orpheus said. "Nobody's keeper ever knew. You don't get to know. All I can tell you is what my grandmother told me, and she had it from hers, and it's just this. It ain't a person, and it ain't a devil, and it ain't the dead. It's a hunger with no body of its own, on the far side of a place where the world wore thin, and it can't cross over, not all the way, not ever. All it can do is reach a hand through the thin spot and feel around on our side in the dark for something warm, and the only thing it can get a proper hold of is a person who's reaching back. That's why it wears the dead. Not because it is the dead, it ain't. It don't even understand the dead. It's got no more notion of your dead wife than a hook has a notion of a fish. But because a reaching back hand is the only thing it can grip, and grief is the surest way there is to get a living person to reach their hand out into the dark. It wears your dead the way a man puts corn on a hook. The corn ain't the point. The corn's just what the fish will reach for. Your Marta, that it hums at your wall, that's the corn, child. You understand me? The thing that's got her voice don't love you and don't hate you, and don't hardly know you're a separate thing from itself. It just knows you'll reach for that shape. And the whole of surviving it is learning not to reach, no matter how good the corn looks, no matter that it looks and sounds and near enough is the one face you'd give your life to see again. Don't reach. That's the rule, under all the rules. Don't reach and don't forget. And someday die in your own bed having done neither. That's a keeper's whole gospel. It ain't much. It's kept me 80 years. Rachel Sallow's book had said, "It cannot come in unless you let it in. Keep your hand off the latch. Count to keep from listening." All true. Orpheus said, all true and all not enough, because the widow Sallow had died believing that the danger was the door, and the door was only the last of it. "The door's the easy part," the old woman said. "Any fool can keep a door shut for one night. If a shut door was all it needed, it ain't. Here's what it needs, and here's what Rachel never rightly understood, and it's why the hollow got her in the end. It don't need you to open the door. It needs you to want to. The opening's just the proof. If you spend the whole 9th night with your hand off the latch, but your heart wide open, wanting, weeping, saying yes to it in every part of you, but your hand then you've already given it what it wants, and it'll take you, door or no door, because you opened the door that matters, which ain't the one on its hinges." And she leaned forward, her hands going still for the first time all afternoon, and she said the thing that I think is the black beating heart of this whole story, the thing Renner underlined. He underlined it. The only underlining in 3 notebooks. She said, "You don't survive the 9th night by keeping it out. You survive it by not wanting it in. And that's a harder door to shut, and it's on the inside, and only you can reach it. You survive it by not wanting it in. Now, how do you do that? How does a man who has lost his wife 8 months gone, who hears her humming climb the wall in the night, who has read that the hollow will wear her face, and use her voice, and weep on his very step, how does that man not want it in?" Renner asked her exactly that, and Orpheus gave him the refined ritual, the real one, and it was crueler and simpler than the widow's counting, and I'll give it to you the way she gave it, because we're going to watch him use it. 2 nights from the afternoon they spoke. On the 9th night, in the worst hours of his life. "Counting's fine," she said. "Count if it helps you keep from listening. But counting's just a wall, and walls come down. Here's the thing that don't come down, when it comes wearing your dead, and it'll come wearing whoever you loved most and lost worst. It always does. That's the shape it builds all the days before. When it comes wearing them, you don't shut your eyes and pretend it ain't them. That don't work. Your heart knows the shape too well. What you do is worse, and it's the only thing that works. You look right at it. You look right at your dead standing there in the cold, begging you, and you find the one thing about it that's wrong. There's always one thing wrong. It's close. God, it's close. It's closer than you could stand to believe, but it's never perfect, because it ain't them. It's the hollow wearing them, and the hollow never quite gets one thing right, because the one thing it can't reach is the one thing that was only ever theirs. You find that wrong thing, and you hold on to it, and you say it out loud, over and over, all night. Not a prayer, not a number, but the wrong thing, the proof it ain't them. And every time you say it, the wanting gets a little smaller, because you can't want a thing all the way once you've truly seen it ain't the thing you want. That's how you live. You don't fight the wanting, you starve it. You feed it the truth till it dies. You feed it the truth till it dies. And Renner, you can feel him doing the arithmetic even as she says it. The careful man, the man who wrote down the price of the coffin, Renner already knew, sitting in Orphemese's warm little house above the thin ground, what the one wrong thing would be. He'd already half heard it. 5 nights of a woman humming by a fire in a way that put him in mind of Marta, and something in him had been snagging on it the whole time without letting him look. Because Marta hummed, but Marta hummed a certain way, low and tuneless and trailing off. Always trailing off, never resolving. The hum of a woman thinking, not a woman performing. And the humming in the hollow, the humming that climbed the wall, it was close, it was so close, but it did not trail off. It held, it sustained. It went on a beat too long and landed a shade too true, the way a thing does when it has learned a sound from the outside but has never once done the thing the sound was for. It had learned the shape of Marta's humming. It had never once hummed because it was thinking, because it did not think, because there was nothing inside it to think, and that one held note, that one beat too long, was the wrong thing. That was the thread that wasn't hers. Renner didn't say this to Orphemise. He wrote it that night, in the loft, in the dark, but he'd found it up on the ridge in the old woman's house 2 days early, and finding it 2 days early is very probably the only reason he is not just another name gone off a Kellam County tax roll. And I want to sit with the strange mercy in Orphemise's rule for a moment, because it is not the rule you would expect a ghost story to give, and the difference is everything. Every instinct we have, faced with a thing wearing the face of someone we lost, is to look away, to shut the eyes, to stop the ears, to refuse to see it, because seeing it is unbearable. And the old woman's rule is the exact opposite of that instinct, and that is why it works. Do not look away, she said. Look harder. Look closer than your grief can stand. Because the thing at the door is counting on your looking away. It needs you to not look, to let the shape stay whole in the corner of your eye, where longing fills in every gap, where a beat too long hum is close enough, and a face half seen in lantern light is close enough, and close enough is all the hook requires. The instant you truly look, the instant you bring the full, cold attention of the living mind to bear on it, the shape begins to fail, because it is not whole. It was never whole. It is a hunger's best guess at a person assembled from the outside, and no guess survives real looking. The mercy in the rule is that it asks the grieving to do the one thing grief most refuses to do, to examine the beloved dead, coldly, for flaws. And it turns out that this cold examination is not a betrayal of the love, but its truest expression, because to look that closely and find the flaw is to know, all over again, exactly what was real and singular and irreplaceable about the one you lost. exactly the thing the copy cannot copy. Renner, looking for the wrong note in the humming, was really doing the tenderest thing a bereaved man can do. He was remembering his wife precisely, in her actual particulars, the real trailing off hum of the real thinking woman, so precisely that no forgery could stand beside the memory. The hollow offered him a Marta close enough to love. And he refused her by loving the real one more exactly than the hollow could counterfeit. That is the whole of the survival ritual, stripped to the bone. Not salt, not iron, not a barred door. Precise memory. Love that refuses to round its beloved off into close enough. The dead are safe from the hollow only in the minds that remember them exactly. And that, too, is why the keepers keep their accounts, and why Renner wrote his out 41 times. And why I tell you these? Because precise memory is the only charm, and it dies the instant we stop speaking. He stayed with Orpha Meese until the light began to go, and she fed him, and I want you to notice this, because Renner did, and it's a small, warm, true thing in the middle of all the cold. She fed him a plain supper, cornbread and milk, and she ate with him, ate her own full share across the table, an old woman eating cornbread and milk with a frightened young man, and it was the first meal Renner had shared in that whole country with someone who actually ate. The Vearns never ate. The thing wearing the Vearns had no reason to. But Orpha Meese was alive, wholly and only alive, and she was hungry, and she ate, and Renner, watching her eat, wrote that night that he had not understood until that moment how much he had missed the simple sight of another living person being hungry at a table. It is such a small thing. It is the whole difference between the living and the thing that wears the dead. The living eat. Hold that. It comes back. Before he left, Orpha Meese told him 2 more things, and then she said, "You'll have felt this coming," she said. She would not speak of it again, and she didn't, and she turned back to her wool. The first thing she told him was the count. "This is your 7th day," she said. "You come in on the 24th. Tomorrow's the 8th. The night after that's the 9th. The 1st of December going into the 2nd, and that's the night it comes to the door. And if you're still down in that hollow when the 9th night falls, you'll face it there, in the Vearns' loft, with them below you the whole night, 3 of them, wearing 3 people, all working on you at once. Don't be down there. Come up here." She offered him her floor for the 9th night, her house above the thin ground, and I'll tell you now, because you'll wonder, that Renner did not take her offer. And the reason he did not is the most human and the most maddening thing in the whole account, and I'll come to it. The second thing she told him was where the thin place was thinnest, where, if he wanted to understand it before he fought it, he could go and see the ground the hollow was wrapped around. There was a clearing, she said, up the hollow past the sallow place, in the deep woods on the western side, and in the clearing there was a thing her grandmother had shown her once and made her swear never to go back to, and she'd kept that oath her whole life. And she'd tell him where it was, but she would not tell him what it was. Because some things you should not have described to you. You should only see, and only once. If you go, she said, go in daylight, go counting, and do not stay past noon, and do not, whatever you find there, speak to it, and do not let it learn your name. Do not let it learn your name. And that was the last thing Orpha Meese said to him before she said she'd not speak of it again, and Renner went back down the ridge in the last light of the 7th day, down across the ruled line of trees, back into the counting ground, with 2 days left and a map in his head to a clearing he'd been warned to see only once. He went the next morning, the 8th day. Of course he went. You would not have, and I would not have, and that is easy for us to say, warm and far away, and not 8 days deep and half mad with counting. Renner went because Renner was a man who could not leave a thing unmeasured, and because he admitted this in the notebook. And it is the truest thing he ever wrote about himself, because some part of him, the part the hollow had been feeding on all along, wanted to go where the thin place was thinnest, wanted to be close to it. The wanting is the hook, and it was inside him. And it was inside him before he ever came here, and it drew him up the hollow on the 8th morning, past the sallow place, and into the deep woods on the western side, counting his paces aloud, 1, 2, 3, 1,000 to the half-mile, into the trees. I'm going to tell you what he found in the clearing, but I'm going to tell you the way he found it, slowly, because he came on it slowly, and because the slowness is the horror, and because we have one more night to get through after this, and I do not want to spend the dread too fast. He found, first, that the woods on the western side got quiet in the wrong way, not the ordinary quiet of winter woods, but a held quiet, the full quiet, the quiet of the mouth of the hollow on the first afternoon, and it got quieter the deeper he went, until he could hear his own blood and the creak of his own boots in the snow, and nothing else, no wind in the high bare branches, though he could see the branches moving, no sound at all from a moving world, as though the clearing ahead of him were the center of a silence the way a drain is the center of a sink. He found, next, that the snow changed. Underfoot, the 6 inches of clean snow he'd been walking on all week gave way, as he neared the clearing, to ground that was bare, not melted, not shoveled, simply bare, dry, dark earth with no snow on it at all, and none, he saw, in the branches above it, a circle of winter ground in the middle of a snowbound woods, where the snow had, for years by the look of it, simply declined to fall, as though the sky above the clearing were somewhere else, some other sky, over some other, warmer, more terrible country. And he found, at the center of the bare circle, the thing Orpheus would not describe, and he wrote it down, and I'll give you his words, and then I'll give you what happened, and then, I think, we'll have earned the 9th night. At the center of the bare circle, Renner wrote, there was a chair. That is the first thing, and it is such a small, ordinary word that I want to let it land the way it landed on him. Not an altar, not a standing stone, not a ring of bones, a chair, a plain ladder-back kitchen chair of the kind that stood in every cabin in that country. In every cabin Renner had catalogued that whole autumn, a chair you'd pull up to a table to eat your supper sitting alone at the exact center of a snowless circle in a silent wood, facing, he noted, the mouth of the hollow, as though someone had set it there to watch the way in. And it was old. It was very old. The wood of it was gray and checked and silvered, the way wood goes after decades in the weather. Except there was no weather here, no snow, no rain, nothing but the dry, dark, bare ground and the held silence, and Renner understood, looking at it, that the chair had not aged from weather. It had aged from time, from sitting, from being sat in, a long, long while, by something that did not need to move. And around the chair, in the bare earth, worn into the dark ground in a ring perhaps 10 feet across, were the marks. Renner circled the chair at a distance to read them, counting his paces the whole way, and he found that the ring was made of footprints, bare human footprints, pressed into ground too hard and cold to take a print, hundreds of them, thousands, all going the same way, round and round the chair, worn so deep by so much patient circling that they had become a trench, a smooth trodden groove in the iron ground, the way a path wears into a hillside over 100 years of feet. Something had walked around that chair for a very long time, round and round, barefoot, in a wood where the snow would not fall, waiting, watching the mouth of the hollow, wearing a groove in the frozen earth with the soles of feet that belonged, Renner realized, and this is the detail that made him stop counting, just for a second. Just one fatal second, the footprints were not all the same size. They were dozens of sizes, small ones and large ones, a child's and a broad man's and a slender woman's, all overlaid, all circling, all going the same patient way, as though the thing that walked there wore a different pair of feet each time, as though it walked in the feet of everyone it had ever taken, as though the widow Sallow was in that groove, and the Vearns before they were the Vearns, and every name that had ever gone off a tax roll in that hollow was down there in the frozen ground, walking, still walking, round and round the empty chair, waiting for the next lonely soul to come up the trace. There was one thing more in that clearing, and Renner almost did not write it down, and when he did he wrote it small at the very bottom of a page, as though he could make it less true by making the letters less large. Beyond the chair, on the far side of the snowless circle, at the edge where the bare dark ground met the trees, there was a structure. He had not seen it at first. It stood back in the shadow of the hemlocks, and it was low, and it was the gray of old wood, and it took him a moment to understand that it was a door frame. Just a door frame. 2 posts and a lintel, a plain door frame of the kind that would stand in the wall of any cabin, built there, free-standing, in the middle of the woods, with no wall around it and no house behind it, framing nothing but more trees, more snowless ground, more shadow. A door to nowhere, standing open in a clearing, facing the chair. And hung in the frame, on old iron hinges, was a door, a real plank door, shut, latched, standing in a frame that led nowhere, in the middle of a wood. And Renner understood, looking at it across the circle, past the empty chair and the worn groove of 1,000 circling feet, that this was the thing itself, or the nearest the thing had to a self on our side of the ground, the thin place made into the shape it best understood us by, a shut door waiting to be opened, from a room with no walls, in a country with no weather, at the bottom of a hunger that had learned in 10,000 lonely nights that the only shape a human heart cannot finally refuse is a door it wants to open. He did not go near it. He did not, God knows, touch it. But he saw, even from across the circle, that the latch on that impossible door was on his side, the outside, as every latch in that hollow was on his side, because the law held even here, even at the center. It cannot come through. It can only ask. The door is always ours to open or to leave. The hunger builds the door and the chair and the groove and waits, forever, latch outward, for a hand. And Renner, looking at a shut door standing in a wall-less frame in a snowless wood, felt his own hand. He wrote this. At the bottom of the page, Small felt his own hand rise a little at his side, of its own accord, toward that far latch it could not possibly have reached, drawn, the way the whole hollow drew him, the way the wanting always drew him, and he made a fist of it, and put it in his coat, and that is when he made himself look down at the groove to break the pull, and read the footprints, and understood whose feet they were, and when he stopped counting that 1 second, to understand the footprints, the chair, which had been facing the mouth of the hollow, was facing him. He had not seen it turn. There had been no sound. He had looked down to read the prints, and looked up, and the plain gray kitchen chair that had been facing away toward the hollow's mouth was facing him, square on, across the bare circle, empty, and the silence was total. And Renner, the careful man, the dry man, the man who wrote down the price of the coffin, Renner ran. He did not measure any more. He turned and ran out of that clearing, back through the 2 quiet woods, counting again, but ragged now, gasping the numbers, and behind him he heard, for the first time all week in the daylight, a sound follow him. Not footsteps, not the humming, but the small dry creak of old wood taking a weight, the sound of someone sitting down, once, behind him, in a chair, and then nothing, and he ran until he was out of the deep woods, and back on the trace with the snow under him again, and the ordinary thin winter wind moving in the branches, And he did not stop until he reached the sallow place, and he leaned against the cold wall of the dead widow's empty house, and he was sick into the snow. And it was not yet noon on the 8th day. He had one night, the 8th, to get through before the 9th. And here is where I have to tell you about the decision, the maddening human decision, because Orpheus had offered him her floor, her house above the thin ground, safe passage through the 9th night, and Renner did not take it. On the evening of the 8th day, he wrote out his reasoning in the loft of the Vearns' cabin, and it is not the reasoning of a fool, which is what makes it so hard to bear. He wrote 3 reasons. The first was practical. The snow had come again, hard, all through the 8th day, and the ridge trail up to Orpheus was steep and iced and half lost, and to climb it in the dark on the 9th night, with the thing awake and hunting and wearing his wife's voice at his back the whole way, seemed to him more dangerous than staying behind a barred door. The second was stubborn, and it was the surveyor in him. He had come to do account, and he had, in a week, learned the true and terrible census of Sorrel Hollow, not 31 souls reduced to 3, but a hollow that had eaten every soul who ever settled it and wore them still, and he wanted, he wrote, to survive the 9th night on the hollow's own ground, in the Vearns' own loft, and walk out in the morning light, having beaten it where it was strongest, so that he could write the whole thing down as a man who had faced it and lived, and not as a man who had run up a hill and hidden. Pride. Call it pride. It nearly killed him. But the third reason was the true one. And he knew it was the true one, even as he wrote the other 2. And he wrote the third one last and smallest, at the very bottom of the page, in the hand that shook. And I confess the last reason, which is the worst, and which I set down, so that, if this book is found, I will at least have been honest. I do not climb to safety, because some part of me does not want to be safe. Some part of me wants to be here, on the thin ground, on the 9th night, when it comes wearing her. Some part of me wants to see her again more than it wants to live. I know now that this wanting is the hollow's, and not mine, that it was planted or found in me and fed all week, but knowing whose it is does not make it stop being felt. I feel it as my own. God help me. I want the 9th night to come. That is the truest measure I have taken in this hollow, and it is of myself, and I do not like the reading. I want the 9th night to come. You feed it the truth till it dies, the old woman had said. But the truth Renner had to feed it was the truth that he, himself, wanted the thing that would kill him. That's the real horror of grief, isn't it? Stripped all the way down. Not that the dead come back, that some cold hour of the night you would open the door if they did, knowing what it cost, and be glad. The hollow didn't invent that in Elias Renner. It just found it. The way it found it in Rachel's Sallow, the way it found it in the Vearns, the way it has found it, I'd wager, in more of us listening tonight than would care to say so in the comments. It's in there. It was in there before you ever heard of Sorrel Hollow. The hollow only knows where to knock. If you're still with me this deep into the dark 8th night, one to go, the chair turned round and the groove worn in the frozen ground, then drop a single word in the comments for me. The name of someone you'd open the door for. You don't have to say more than the name. I just want to know how many of us are carrying one. Then stay close. And keep the lamp where it is, because the 9th night is next, and it is the reason this whole story exists, and I am not going to rush a second of it. The 9th night. The 1st of December, 1891, going into the 2nd. Renner spent the last of the daylight preparing the loft the way a man prepares a position he means to hold. He dragged the cedar chest against the door and braced it with the bed frame. He checked the shutter over the loft window and nailed it. He'd found a hammer and nails in the Vearns' lean-to, and the fact that they let him take them, that they watched him nailing himself in with their warm, expecting smiles and said nothing, told him they knew it would not matter. that the door and the shutter were never the point. He set his lantern where he could reach it. He laid out his 3 notebooks and a pencil, because if he lived, he meant to write it down, and if he did not, he wanted the books found. And he sat down against the wall facing the barred door, in the last of the light, and he waited, and below him in the cabin he could hear the 3 Vearns moving about, and then he could hear them stop, all at once, the way a clock stops, and the cabin went silent, and the light failed in the shutter cracks, and the 9th night came down over Sorrel Hollow, like a hand laid gently over a mouth. For a long time hours, by his lantern-lit notes, which he kept the whole night, God bless him, he kept counting and he kept writing. The 2 things that were only his for a long time, there was nothing. That was the first cruelty, the waiting. He had braced himself for the humming to climb the wall at midnight the way it had every night. And midnight came, by his reckoning, and passed. And there was nothing, only the silence and the cold, and his own counting under his breath, 1 to 40 and back, and the longer nothing came, the more the wanting rose in him, because, and the hollow knew this, the hollow had done this before 10,000 times, because a man braced against a horror will, if you make him wait long enough in the dark, begin to long for the horror to simply come, will begin to feel that anything at all, even the worst thing, is better than the waiting. And right at the moment when Renner felt that longing crest in him, right when some part of him nearly called out into the dark just to end the silence, that is when he heard, from the yard below the nailed window, not the humming, but a voice, speaking, low, warm, tired, the particular tiredness of a woman at the end of a long day, Marta's voice, saying his name. Elias. Just that, Elias. The way she'd said it 1,000 times, coming in from the yard, calling him to supper. Elias. And, Renner, I want you to understand what he did, because it is the bravest and the strangest thing in the whole account, and it is exactly what Orpha Meese told him to do, and it nearly wasn't enough. He did not answer. He did not go to the window, but he also did not shut his eyes and pretend it was not her, because the old woman had told him that never works, the heart knows the shape too well. Instead, he opened his eyes wide in the dark, and he looked toward the voice, and he made himself listen to it, really listen, all the way in, closer than his breaking heart could stand, and he listened for the one wrong thing. And at first he could not find it. That was the terror of the 9th night. The thing had had 9 days to build the shape, 9 days of watching him, of learning, of feeding, and it was better now, so much better than the held note by the fire, and when it said, Elias, it trailed off at the end exactly the way she used to. It had learned even that, it had learned the trailing off, and for one endless plunging moment, Renner could not find a single thing about the voice in the yard that was not, in every particular, his dead wife calling him to supper, and his hand, he wrote this, in the dark. His hand came off his knee and moved, on its own, an inch, 2 inches, toward the floor, toward the ladder, toward the door, and the latch, and the yard, and the voice. And the wanting was a flood now, over his head, and he was drowning in it, and he could not find the wrong thing, and he was going to open the door. What saved him was cornbread and milk. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like a small and foolish thing to set against a flood that had a grieving man's hand 2 inches from a latch he'd swore his life on. But that is exactly how these things are saved, in the true accounts, never by a great gesture, always by some small, dry, true thing. The horror was too large to think of, and Renner wrote it out, in the dark, in the minutes after, his hand steadying as he wrote, and I'll give it to you the way he understood it. As his hand moved toward the ladder, drowning, unable to find the wrong thing in the voice, his eye fell on his own supper, which was sitting untouched on the floor of the loft beside him. The Vearns had sent it up with him at dusk cornbread and a cup of milk the way they'd fed him every night. And he had not eaten it. He never ate much those last nights. His stomach was a knot. And looking at that plate, in the drowning dark, one clear thought surfaced in Elias Renner. A surveyor's thought. A fact, cold and true. In 9 days in that hollow, he had never once seen a Vearn eat. Not a mouthful. They served, and they pressed, and they watched, and they smiled, and they did not eat. Because the thing that wore them had no hunger. A plate could answer, and Marta, his Marta, living Marta, had loved to eat, had eaten like a woman who worked, with appetite, with pleasure, had teased him for his knotted stomach, had said a person who won't eat their supper won't dream any good dreams. And the voice in the yard, calling him to supper, Elias, Elias, come down, had never once, in 9 nights, been attached to a single thing eating. The thing wearing Marta's voice was calling him down to a table it could not sit at. It knew the word supper. It did not know the thing. That was the wrong thing. Not the humming, after all. The supper, and Renner, his hand already on the ladder rail. Renner said it out loud, into the dark, the way the old woman told him to. Not a prayer, not a number, but the truth, the proof it wasn't her. He said, "You don't eat." His own voice, cracked and strange after a night of silence. "You don't eat." She ate. "You've never eaten. You don't eat." And he says he wrote this that the voice in the yard stopped mid-word, the way Rachel Sallow's sentence stopped mid-word, and for one moment there was pure silence, the held silence of the clearing, the silence of a thing that has been seen. And then the voice came again, and it was still Marta's, still perfect, still warm. But it was saying something new now, something wheedling. And the wheedling is how he knew he'd cut it. "Elias, I'm so cold. Let me in. I'm so cold. And I'm so hungry. I've been hungry so long." And Renner said, louder, "No, no. She's not hungry. She's dead, and she's at rest, and she is not hungry, and you don't eat. You don't eat. You don't eat." And he took his hand off the ladder, and he put his back against the wall, and he said it over and over all night. Into the dark you don't eat. You don't eat, feeding the truth to the wanting, the way you'd feed a fire you meant to keep alive. And every time he said it, the flood went down a little, an inch, a hand's breadth, because he was right, and the thing outside knew he was right, and a thing that has been truly seen cannot get all the way back into the shape it was seen out of. But it did not give up. I want to be honest about the length of that night, because Renner was, and because the thing that makes the 9th night so terrible in his account is not that it was violent, but that it was long and patient, and it tried everything, and it did not stop trying until the sun cleared the eastern ridge. When Marta's voice failed, the voices changed. The hollow had had 9 days to learn him, but it had had 30 years to learn everyone, and it reached back into all of it. It came to the door, knocking now, soft, the way the widow Sallow warned, a soft knuckle knock low on the boards, and it was not Marta anymore. It was a child's voice, a little boy, crying, saying he was lost, saying he was cold, saying, "Please, mister, please," and Renner did not know that voice. It wasn't his, and for that reason it was almost easier, and he counted through it, 1 to 40 and back. Then it was an old man's voice, querulous and afraid, an old man saying he'd fallen in the snow and couldn't get up, and with the young man in there, for the love of God, just open the door and help an old man up, and that one was harder, because there is a decency in us that answers helplessness. And the hollow knew it. The hollow had learned that the door of pity opens as easily as the door of grief. And Renner counted and said the truth and did not open the door. And then it did the cleverest and the cruelest thing of the whole night, and I want to give it to you carefully, because it is the moment the hollow nearly won, the moment after Renner thought the worst was past, because the hollow, having tried the child and the old man and been counted through, went quiet, a long quiet, the settling quiet, the quiet that made Renner think, God help him, that it might be giving up, that dawn might be close, that he might have done it, and into that quiet, softly, it brought Marta back. But not Marta weeping, not Marta cold at the door, something worse, something so much worse, the thing he had not braced for because no one could brace for it. Marta, as she had been on an ordinary evening. The voice came from the yard, low, warm, unhurried, not begging at all, just talking to him the way she used to talk while she worked, an easy ruining murmur of nothing, of the day, of small things, the leaking roof and the price of thread, and a joke about his knotted stomach, and did he remember the walk they took the second spring by the river? When it rained and they didn't care and it was all right, every detail, it was all exactly right, because the hollow had had 9 days inside his own grief to gather it, and it laid it all out gently in the dark, not asking for anything, not asking him to open the door at all, just being her, easily, warmly, the sound of the house being alive. For a man who had not heard the house be alive in 8 months and had not known, until that moment, how starved he was for just that, not the grand grief, but the small daily music of another person murmuring in the next room. And that nearly finished him, because there was nothing to refuse. It made no demand. It only offered him, free, for nothing, the exact texture of the life that had been taken from him, and asked him only to listen, and go on listening, and not be alone with the silence any more. And Renner listened. He could not help it, he wrote. No man could have helped it, and he felt the wanting come up, not as a flood this time, but as a warmth, a settling, a letting go, the most dangerous feeling there is, the feeling that it would be so easy and so sweet and so harmless to just keep listening, to answer, to say one word back, to say her name, just once, into the dark, just to have said it to something that answered, and his mouth opened, and her name was in it, and he very nearly said it, and saying it would have been the reaching, saying it would have been the hand out into the dark, and he knew it, and he could not stop it. The name was coming, and what saved him the second time that night was the same thing that had saved him the first. He heard, under the warm, easy murmur, so faint at the end of one of her sentences, the humming. The thinking hum, started and held, a beat too long, because the thing could wear her voice and her memories and her easy evening murmur, could wear all of it now to the life, but it could not stop being what it was underneath, and what it was underneath was a hunger with no thought in it, and when it hummed, it still could not hum the way a thinking woman hums, trailing off, because there was nothing in it thinking, and the held note came through under the murmur like a bone through skin, and Renner shut his mouth on her name, and swallowed it, and said instead, aloud, shaking, "You hold the note." She never held the note. "You hold it because there's nothing in you to let it go. You're not thinking. You're not her. You hold the note." And the warm, easy murmur stopped, the way everything the hollow tried stopped when he named the wrong thing in it, and there was the settling quiet again, and then the whole assault began once more. From the beginning, the child, the old man, Yada weeping, Marta murmuring, round, and Renner understood that it would do this all night. Cycle through every door into him it had, over and over, testing each latch again and again, because it had all night, and it had all its faces, and it needed him to fail at only one of them, only once. And he set his back against the wall, and he made the truth into a wall of its own. You don't eat. You hold the note. She's at rest. she'd want me warm, and he held it, latch by latch, hour by hour, against everything the hollow loved him with. And below him, this is the part I find hardest to sit with, below him, in the cabin, the three Vearns were awake and working. He could hear them all night. They did not come up the ladder. They could not, any more than the voices could lift the latch. The law of the thing held even for them, but they talked to him. Low, up through the loft floor, three warm, patient voices that had once been Amos and Isaiah and Prudence Vearn, and were now only the hollow wearing them, and they did not weep, and they did not beg, they reasoned. That was the cruelest voice of all, Renner wrote. Not the weeping outside, but the reasoning below, the warm, sensible talk of the taken, telling him it didn't hurt, that they were happy, that being kept was better than being alone, that he'd been alone so long, that Marta was so close now, just outside, that all he had to do was stop being so stubborn and so proud, and come down and open the door, and it would be over, and he would never be lonely again, not for 1 hour, not ever, for as long as the hollow stood. It's easier when you stop fighting, brother, Amos Vearn's voice said, up through the floor, gentle as a hand on the shoulder. We all fought the first night. Every one of us fought, and every one of us was glad, after, that we lost. You'll be glad too. Come down. And Prudence's voice, low, under the others, humming the held note, a beat too long. And Renner sat in the dark against the wall, with the truth in his mouth like a stone, and he counted, and he said, "You don't eat." And he did not go down. And it worked. That's the thing I most want you to carry out of this. Orpha-Misa's cruel, simple ritual worked not cleanly, not without cost. I'll come to the cost, but it worked. And it worked because it was true, and the hollow, for all its patience and all its faces, could not make a true thing false. Somewhere in the blackest part of the night, the part with no hour to it, the voices began to change again, and this time not into new voices, but into worse versions of the old, the warmth going out of them, the wheedling turning to something flatter and colder and older, the sound of a thing setting down a mask it can no longer make work, and Prudence's humming stopped, and Marta's voice stopped, and the reasoning below stopped, and for the last hour or two before dawn, there was only a single sound, which Renner describes and then says he will not describe again, and true to his word, he never does. A sound at the door, low down, not a knock now, but a slow, dry, circling scrape, round and round the base of the door. The sound he does let himself write. This much the sound of something walking a small, tight circle, just outside, barefoot, patient, wearing a groove, waiting the way. It had waited around a chair in a snowless clearing for longer than the county had a name. It walked its circle at his door until the light came. And when the first gray of dawn showed in the cracks of the nailed shutter, when, by the law the widow sat down, the sun cleared the eastern ridge, and the 9th night was spent, the scraping stopped, all at once, like a clock stopping, and the hollow let him go. He did not move for a long time. He wrote that too. He sat against the wall in the growing light until he was certain, and then past certain, and I want to give you those last hours before the dawn as he gave them, because the 9th night did not end with a bang or a shriek, but with something quieter and, to my mind, more terrible. It ended with the thing at the door giving up, and a man listening to it give up, and not daring, for a long time, to believe it. Near the end, he wrote, in the last black hour before the gray came, the circling scrape at the base of the door slowed. It had gone all night, that slow, dry, barefoot circle, round and round the threshold, patient, wearing its groove, and now, near dawn, it slowed, and the humming under it thinned, and the warm, reasoning voices below him in the cabin, which had talked to him all night through the floor, went quiet one by one. Prudence last, her held note hum, trailing away, not trailing off the way a thinking woman's does. He noted even then, even at the very end, the surveyor in him still measuring, but simply stopping, cut off, the way a machine stops. And then there was only the scrape, slower and slower. And then, between one circle and the next, it did not begin again, and the silence that came down after it was not the held silence of the hollow, the full silence, the waiting silence. It was, for the first time in 9 days, an empty silence, an ordinary silence. The silence of a cold, dusty cabin in the last dark before a winter dawn, with a spent and shaking man in the loft, and nothing at all. At the door, the hollow had counted to 9, and reached the bottom of its count, and by the law the widow set down if you last the 9th night till the sun clears the eastern ridge, it must let you go. It had let him go. He had lasted. He did not believe it. He sat against the wall with the truth still in his mouth. You don't eat, you hold the note, saying it now to a silence that no longer answered, afraid that the silence was a trick, the last and cleverest trick, and he did not stop saying it. And he did not move, until the light in the shutter cracks had gone from gray to the thin gold of real morning, until the sun, somewhere beyond the ruled ridge, had truly cleared it, and only then did he get up, on legs that would barely hold him, and pull the bed frame and the cedar chest away from the door, and lift the latch himself, his own hand on his own latch, in the daylight, the only safe time a hand can be on that latch, and come down the ladder into the Vearns' cabin. And the cabin was empty. The fire was cold, days cold, ash-skinned and dusty, though he had watched them tend it the evening before. The table had a skin of dust on it. The 3 tin plates on the shelf had dust in them. The whole cabin had the still, long, empty, apple-in-the-cold front room feeling of the other 3 houses in the hollow, the feeling of a place no living thing had tended in a long, long time, and Renner understood, standing in it in the morning light, that it had been that way the whole while, that there had never been 3 living Vearns keeping a warm cabin, that he had eaten 9 suppers in a house full of dust and never seen it, because the hollow had not wanted him to see it, and now the 9th night was over, and the hollow had no more reason to keep up the warm room, and the warm room was gone, and what was left was the truth of the place, which was dust and cold and a stopped clock, and 3 tin plates no hand had touched in 30 years. And there was one thing more in that cold cabin in the morning, and it is the detail I would leave you with above all the others from the hollow itself, because it is the one that turns the whole 9 days, in retrospect, from a haunting into a heartbreak. On the table, in the dust, there were marks, fresh marks, made in the night, made in the skin of dust by hands he had heard working below him, and the marks were the places where 3 plates had been set out and taken up, and set out again, and where a bowl had stood, and a ladle, the clean shapes of a supper laid and cleared, and laid again pressed into 30 years of dust, over and over, all night, while above them a living man refused to come down. They had laid the table for him all night, not to trap him, or not only to trap him. They had laid it the way you lay a table for someone you love who is late, who you keep believing will still come, whose plate you cannot bring yourself to put away. 9 suppers he had eaten in that cabin, and on the 9th night, when he would not come down to the 10th, the taken Vearns had gone on laying his place anyway, in the dark, in the dust, hoping, until the dawn made them stop. And Renner stood over those marks in the dust, in the cold morning light, a free man, a living man, a man who had won. And he wept again the 3rd time, and the last time the record notes. And it was not from fear, and not from relief, but from that same terrible pity that had been the truest thing in him all along, pity for a little girl who grew up in a full hollow, and hummed, while she thought and was taken, and had spent 30 years laying a table in the dust for strangers who would not stay. And he could not help her. No one could help her. There was nothing to do for her but leave, and he left. He took his 3 notebooks and his pack and his instruments, and he left everything else. He took his 3 notebooks and his pack and his instruments, and he left everything else, and he walked out of that cabin into the morning and down the sorrel trace toward the mouth of the hollow, and he did not go up the ridge to thank Orphemis. And he has a line about that near the end of the 3rd notebook that I think about often. He wrote that he could not face the climb and that he could not face her. Either could not face the one living person in that country who ate at her own table and kept the account of the thin place year after lonely year, because he was ashamed, he wrote, of how close he had come, of the 2 inches his hand had moved, of the confession he'd set down on the 8th night that some part of him had wanted the door to open. He could not look at a woman who had never wanted it and tell her he almost had. So he walked past the foot of her ridge without climbing it, and he went down out of Sorrel Hollow, and near the mouth, where the trace widened and the ridges fell back, and the ordinary thick ground of the world began again, he found Coy Aldous waiting with the wagon Aldous, who had said he would not speak of it again, and had not, but who had come back on the morning of the 10th day, the way he had come back on the morning of the 10th day, for how many other census-takers and land-buyers and lonely, hopeful strangers over the years to see which ones walked out. Most did not. Renner did. And Coy Aldous, when he saw the young man come walking down out of the notch in the morning light, gray and shaking and alive, did not smile and did not speak. He just climbed down off the wagon seat and helped Elias Renner up into it and turned the team around and drove him down out of that country, and neither of them said a single word the whole way, because there was not a word in all the plain language of those plain people that would hold what needed to be said. But I have to give you the walk down the trace, before the wagon, because Renner gave it to us, and because it is the last of the Hollow's small horrors, and in some ways the quietest and the worst. He walked down the sorrel trace in the morning light of the 10th day, past the 3 empty cabins he had catalogued 9 days before, and they were different now, not changed in any way he could have measured, changed in that he could see them now, at last, for what they were. The Vearn cabin behind him, dust and cold. The first empty cabin with the apples, which he now knew for a grave that smiled. And as he passed the second empty cabin, the one with the table laid for 4 and never eaten, he made himself look in through the open door one last time, and the table was still laid, the 4 dusty plates, the ladle standing in the bowl, the loneliest object he had ever stood in a room with, and he understood, walking past it, that he had been within one tired moment, on the 6th night, of being the 5th plate at that table, or at one exactly like it, that the whole hollow was that room, that laid and dusted and waiting supper, repeated in every empty house, and in the barn's banked stalls, and in the chair in the clearing, a valley that had set a place for every lonely soul who ever came and was still, patiently, setting them, and that the only difference between Elias Renner and every name gone off the tax roll was that he was walking past the laid table toward the mouth of the hollow, instead of sitting down at it. He walked faster. He counted his paces one last time down the trace, and near the mouth, where the ridges fell back, the counting steadied into something else, into the ordinary rhythm of a man's boots on a road going home, and the held silence of the hollow thinned behind him, and gave way all at once. At a certain point on the trace he marked the spot. The surveyor in him marked even that, to the ordinary thin sounds of an ordinary winter world. A crow somewhere, wind in bare branches, the small living racket of thick ground, and Renner stopped at that line, at the exact place where the hollow's silence ended, and he turned around and looked back up into Sorrel Hollow one time, and he did not see anything, no figure, no smiling three on a distant porch. Nothing but a snowbound valley in the morning light, with a ruled straight line of dark hemlock along both ridges. And that ruled line, that impossible clean edge, was the last thing he saw of the place, and it was enough, and he turned his back on it and walked the last of the way down to where Coy Aldous sat waiting with the team, and did not look back again. Coy Aldous, 30 years on, an old man himself by then, talked about that morning reluctantly, the way he talked about all of it reluctantly, to a great-nephew who wrote some of it down. And what he said fills in the one thing Renner's own account could not, which is what Renner looked like coming out. Aldous said he had carried a good number of people up to the mouth of that hollow over the years, census men, a timber buyer once, a family of hopeful settlers he tried and failed to talk out of it, a young preacher who meant to see for himself, and that he made it his business, when he could, to come back on the 10th morning, and that most times, no one came out, and he would wait a while in the cold, and then turn the team and go home, and not speak of it. But now and again one came out, he said, and you could tell the ones who came out from a long way off, before you could see their faces, by the way they walked like a man carrying something heavy that nobody else can see, Aldous said, and setting each foot down like he don't quite trust the ground to be there. And he said Renner came out walking like that, gray and old in the face though he was young, and that he helped him up into the wagon, and Renner sat with his 3 notebooks held against his chest with both arms, like a child holding something, the whole way down, and never said a word, and that, when they reached the county road, at last, and the first ordinary house came into view, with smoke rising honest from its chimney, and a dog barking and washing frozen on a line, Elias Renner made a sound, one sound, Aldous said, that he never forgot. Not a sob and not a laugh, but something between, the sound a man makes at the sight of ordinary life, when he has been somewhere that ordinary life could not follow. And then he was quiet again, and they drove on, and that was the last Coy Aldous ever saw of him, and he said he was glad Renner got out, and glad he never had to see whether he stayed out, and that he, Aldous, stopped carrying anyone up to Sorrel Hollow after that winter, and told anyone who asked for the trip that the road was washed out, which was a lie, and the best lie he ever told, and the one he was least sorry for. I told you at the very beginning that the escape from a place like Sorrel Hollow is never clean, that the ones who get out are marked for life, and I want to make good on that now, because the marks Elias Renner carried out of that hollow are, to me, the truest and the saddest part of this whole account, sadder than the 9th night, sadder than the chair in the clearing. He walked out alive. He was one of the very few who did, and he spent the next 41 years of his life proving that walking out alive is not the same as getting free. He came down out of Kellam County in the first week of December, 1891, and he turned in his papers to the county clerk. And I'll come to what the clerk did with them, because that's a promise I made you at the start. And I keep my promises. But the turning in itself is worth a moment, because there is a small human scene in it that survives. And it tells you how a thing like Sorrel Hollow travels not in shouts and headlines, but in the quiet way. One careful, frightened man hands a folder to another careful, frightened man across a county desk, and they look at each other, and they both decide, without a word, not to say aloud the thing they both now know. Renner did not report the hollow the way he'd reported the dozen others that autumn, a tidy enumeration, so many souls, so many deaths, filed and forgotten. He sat in a boarding house in the county seat for 3 days first, and he wrote it all out fair, the whole account, the 9 days, the arithmetic, the widow's book copied entire, the rules, everything. And then he did a thing that tells you exactly what kind of man he was, and exactly how much the hollow had changed him. He wrote, at the head of the fair copy, a plain recommendation in the flat official language of a state enumerator that the hollow known as Sorrel or the notch be struck from all future survey and settlement rolls, that no further enumerators be sent into it, and that the county consider, in the interest of public safety, the permanent closing of the trace. And then, because he was honest to the bone, he added a single sentence of explanation that must have cost him more than all the rest, a sentence a state official simply does not write, and he wrote it anyway, and it is in the record. I am unable to complete the enumeration of this hollow because I have concluded that its inhabitants are not, in the sense the census intends, alive, and cannot be counted among either the living or the dead, and I do not believe any further enumerator sent there will return. He signed it, and he carried it to the county clerk. And the clerk, an older man, born in the county, who had been clerk a long time and had, we may be sure, seen Sorrel Hollow come across his desk before, in the tax rolls that never quite balanced, and the census of 1880 that counted a graveyard, and the occasional missing timber buyer or vanished settler, whose kin came asking, and were gently told, the road was washed out. The tent clerk read Renner's report through, in front of him, in the quiet of the office, and Renner watched him read it, and he wrote afterward that the clerk's face did not change at all, did not go pale, did not frown, showed no surprise whatever, and that the very absence of surprise was the most frightening confirmation he received in the whole affair. The face of a man reading, in a stranger's hand, a thing he had known and not said for 30 years. The clerk finished it. He set it down. He looked at Renner for a moment across the desk, and what he said, Renner recorded it. The last words anyone in Kellam County said to him about the hollow, what the clerk said was only, "You climbed the ridge, then?" to the old woman. Not a question. And Renner said yes. And the clerk nodded slowly and said, "Most don't. Most stay in the warm room." And that was all. He did not thank Renner, or argue with him, or ask him to soften the language, or tell him he was mad. He took the folder, and he squared its edges on the desk, the way a bookkeeper squares a thing that is finished, and he reached for his pen, and Renner, who did not yet know what the man was about to write across the top of it, got up and put on his coat, and went out into the cold, and left Kellam County the next morning, and never came back. But first, the man himself. Renner did not go back to Wheeling. He never went back to the river town where he'd married Marta and buried Marta, and the people who knew him afterward said he never spoke of why, but I think we can read it plainly enough in what he'd written on the 8th night. He could not go back to the one place in the world most full of her, because he had learned, on the thin ground, exactly how much of him still wanted her back, and he did not trust that wanting any more. He had felt it turned into a weapon and pointed at his own heart. A man who has felt that does not go home to the rooms where the wanting is strongest. He goes somewhere new and plain and full of strangers, and he tries to build a life with no unlatched doors in it. Renner went east, to a town in the Alleghenies where nobody knew him, and he took work as a county surveyor, the same trade, the measuring, the writing down, the one thing that had been only his in the dark, and he lived there quietly for the rest of his life. But he lived there marked. And here are the marks, the ones the people around him noticed and remarked on, and after he was gone, remembered. Because a marked man is remembered for his marks. The first, and the one everyone mentioned, was the door. Elias Renner barred his door every night, all his life, in a peaceful town where nobody barred anything, where doors stood, unlocked, and neighbors walked in without knocking. Renner barred his door at nightfall with a heavy oak bar he'd made himself, and set in iron brackets, and he checked it, and he checked it again. And the woman who kept house for him in his later years said he could not go up to bed until he had put his own hand flat against the barred door, and stood there a moment, feeling it hold, the way another man might say his prayers. It was not fear of thieves. There was nothing to steal. It was the 9th night, every night, For 41 years the ritual of a man who had learned in his marrow that the one thing that must never happen is that a door gets opened in the dark, and who could not, ever again, trust the night to keep itself out on its own. The second mark was the counting. He counted, under his breath, when he thought no one could hear, and the people close to him learned the sound of it, a low, steady murmur of numbers, 1 to 40 and back, 1 to 40 and back, when he was tired or troubled, or when the wind rose at night. Children in that town, the way children do, mocked it a little, the old surveyor muttering his numbers, and their parents, the way parents do, told them to hush, that Mr. Renner had been through something once, out west, in the mountains, and that the counting was how he kept himself steady, and that it was not a thing to laugh at. They did not know what he was counting, or against what. They only knew that when the old man got that far-off look and his lips began to move over the numbers, it was best to sit with him and be quiet and let him count until whatever it was had passed. And it always passed. For 41 years it always passed. And the third mark, the one that tells you the hollow never entirely let go, that a thing which has counted you once keeps your name in its ledger, the third mark was the humming. He could not bear it. Any humming, from anyone, at any time, a woman humming over her sewing, a boy humming down a lane, a hummed tune from a neighbor's kitchen, and Elias Renner would go white and go still and have to leave the room, and the housekeeper learned, over the years, never to hum and to warn visitors gently, before they came, that Mr. Renner had a peculiarity about it, that it was better not to hum in his house. She did not know why. He never told her. But you and I know why. You and I know that the last thing that ever tried to lift the latch of Elias Renner's heart wore the shape of a woman humming low and tuneless by a fire, a beat too long, holding the note, and that a man who has heard that once will hear it under every hum for the rest of his life, and will never again be able to tell, in the first cold instant, whether the sound is a living person thinking or the thin ground reaching, still, after all these years, from a hollow 100 miles and 40 winters away. There is one incident from the middle years that I have to give you, because it is the one time in the 41 years that the marks came off the man and were seen plainly by other people, and because it tells you the hollow never fully let go, that a thing which has counted you once keeps a hand, however faint, however far, on the thread of you. It was in the winter of 1911, roughly the midpoint of Renner's long exile, and he was a man of about 50 then, settled, respected, the county surveyor, and he had been persuaded against his nature, for he did not go out much at night to attend a winter gathering at a neighbor's house, a supper and singing, the ordinary, warm, social evening of a small mountain town. And the evening went well, by all accounts. Renner pleasant and dry and good company, until late, when the plates were cleared and the lamps were low, and a young woman of the household, a girl of maybe 19, sat by the fire with some sewing in her lap, content, half asleep in the warmth, and began, without thinking, the way people do, to hum, low, tuneless, to herself, over her work. And the people in that room saw Elias Renner, the calm, dry, respected surveyor, go absolutely white and rise from his chair without a word, and back away from the fire toward the wall, staring at the girl, at an ordinary, drowsy girl humming over her sewing, with an expression that one of the witnesses this account survives, because more than one person there wrote or spoke of it afterward. It frightened them that badly, one witness said, was not fear exactly, but recognition, the face of a man who has seen someone he buried. And Renner's lips began to move, and those near enough heard that he was counting, rapidly, under his breath, 1 to 40 and back, backing to the wall, his eyes never leaving the humming girl, and the room went silent, and the girl looked up and stopped, bewildered, a little frightened herself now, and asked, was he unwell? And At the sound of her ordinary, young voice asking an ordinary, kind question, the spell broke, and Renner came back into himself, and was terribly, formally, ashamedly apologetic, and made some excuse about a chill and his heart and the lateness, and got his coat and went home early through the snow to his barred door, and was never, after that night, persuaded to a social evening again. The town was kind about it. The town had, by then, its settled understanding. Mr. Renner had been through something once, out west, and there were sounds he couldn't bear, and it was not to be inquired into, and the young of the town were told, gently, not to hum around the old surveyor, and they didn't, and life went on. But I want you to sit with what that was. 20 years gone from the hollow, 100 miles of thick, ordinary ground between him and the thin place, a safe, warm room full of kind neighbors and firelight, and one drowsy girl hums 4 bars over her sewing, and a grown man of 50 is right back in the loft with the cedar chest against the door and the thing climbing the wall in his dead wife's voice, backing to the wall, counting, white, seeing someone he buried. That is what a marked man is. Not a man who remembers a bad thing, a man for whom the bad thing is never fully past, for whom a single ordinary sound can, without warning, thin the 20 years and the 100 miles to nothing, and put him back on the 9th night in the dark, with his hand near a latch. He carried the hollow in him. He carried it his whole life. The door he barred every night was never really the door of his house. That is what getting out cost him. A barred door, a counted number, and a silence where humming used to be every day for the rest of his life. He was, by all accounts, not an unhappy man. Exactly, he was kind and dryly funny, and good at his work, and the town was fond of him, but he was a man with 3 locks on him that never came off. And the people who loved him around the locks, the way you love anyone who came back from something carrying part of it still. He never married again. Of course he didn't. He had learned, on the thin ground, that the door grief opens is the most dangerous door there is, and he was not going to stand himself in front of it a second time. He kept his account books, and he barred his door, and he counted himself to sleep, and the years went by, and Sorrel Hollow, 100 miles west, sat in its fold of the mountains with its ruled line of trees, and its snowless clearing, and its empty houses, and counted its own slow count, and waited, the way it always waited, for the next lonely soul to come up the trace. And I'll tell you, before we get to the end of Renner's own life, what became of the hollow itself, because it is its own quiet horror, and it is the answer to a question you may not have known you were asking. You may have been wondering, this whole while, why nobody ever did anything about Sorrel Hollow. Why, if the county knew, and the county did know, in the way that these things are known, half believed and never spoken, why nobody ever went in and burned the cabins, or blocked the trace, or set up some sign at the mouth of the hollow to turn the lonely and the hopeful away. And the answer is the saddest institutional fact in this whole account, and I have it from the Kellam County records themselves, which, as I told you at the start, were unusually good for a place that poor. The answer is that they tried, once, and it didn't take. In the spring of 1892, the spring after Renner walked out a party of men from the county seat, prompted by something in Renner's report, went up into Sorrel Hollow in the daylight, in numbers, in the safe green part of the year when the ground, I suspect, was at its thickest, and they did exactly what you'd hope. They burned the 4 cabins. They burned the Vearn place and the Sallow place, and the 2 empty ones, burned them to the stone chimneys, so that no lonely stranger would ever again find a warm-looking house in that hollow to shelter in. And they went home satisfied, and they wrote it up, and the file might have ended there, except that the cabins came back. Not all at once. The county didn't send anyone up to check for years. There was no reason to, But the next census taker to pass that way, in the early 1900s, reported 4 sound cabins standing in Sorrel Hollow, roofs whole, doors shut, wood stacked under the eaves, exactly as before, as though no fire had ever touched them. And I have to give you the one further detail from that later census taker's report because it is the coldest confirmation in the whole long file, and because it tells you the hollow had learned nothing and forgotten nothing and lost nothing in the burning, had simply, patiently rebuilt its trap and gone back to waiting. That census taker, a man named, the record says, Furrow, which is another of those names too apt to be invented, and yet there it is, walked up the sorrel trace on a summer day in the thick green safe part of the year, and found the 4 cabins standing, and found, at the second of them, smoke rising from the chimney and 3 people on the porch, 2 brothers and their sister, who came out to meet him before he knocked, smiling, warm, as though they had been expecting him a long while, and who fed him, and pressed food on him, and ate nothing themselves, and whom he recorded not knowing, never knowing, walking back down out of the hollow that same afternoon, by the grace of God and the thickness of the summer ground, whom he recorded in his neat official hand as the Vearn household, Amos, Isaiah, and Prudence, ages given as though they were living people, in a census taken. 21 years after Elias Renner watched their warm room turn to dust, and 42 years after Rachel Sallow's book says the 3 of them were taken in the winter of 1879. Still there, still smiling, still setting a place. The burning had not touched them, because you cannot burn what is already gone. The fire took the wood the hollow wore, and the hollow simply put on new wood, banked its beds fresh in a new barn, hung new apples in a new cold front room, and set the 3 Vearns back out on a new porch to smile the next stranger in. Furrow lived. Furrow, it seems, was not lonely, or not lonely enough, or came in the wrong season and walked back out with his little census of the dead and never knew what he had eaten supper beside. But the report is there, in the file, under Renner's, under the word settled, a second sighting of the smiling Vearns, 2 decades on, alive on paper, forever, in the careful hand of a man who never knew he'd met them. And when someone finally went and compared that report to the 1892 burning, and somebody with a long memory in the county clerk's office put the 2 pieces of paper side by side, there was a quiet meeting, and a decision was made, and the decision was the one that these poor, plain, frightened, sensible people always make in the end. The only decision that had ever really worked. They decided to leave it alone, to stop writing it down, to let the trace grow over, and take the hollow off the maps, and simply never send anyone up there again, and never speak of it, and let the thing on the thin ground keep its own and count it slow. Count and starve, at least, for lack of new souls foolish or lonely enough to be steered its way. You cannot kill thin ground. You cannot burn a hunger down to the chimney stones. All you can do, the old woman on the ridge had said it, hadn't she? The danger is people forgetting the ground is thin and building on it, and being lonely there. All you can do is make sure nobody builds there, nobody stays there, nobody comes. And so Kellam County did the one wise thing a county can do about a hollow that eats the lonely. It forgot it on purpose. It made the hollow a blank on the map. It let Sorrel Hollow disappear, which is why you have never heard of it, which is why, when you search for it, you will not find it. That is not a failure of the record. That is the record working exactly as the frightened men of Kellam County meant it to. They unmade the hollow, on paper, so that no lonely soul would ever go looking. And it worked. For 130 years it worked, and the only reason you are hearing about it tonight, the only crack in that long, deliberate forgetting, is a set of 3 notebooks that one marked careful, sleepless man refused to let anyone throw away. Which brings me, at last, to the clerk and to the word. I promised you, at the very start, that when Elias Renner turned in his papers to the county clerk of Kellam County in December of 1891, the clerk read them and wrote a single word across the top of the file and closed it, and, as far as anyone can tell, never opened it again. And I told you I wanted you to earn the word the way Renner earned it, and I think now, 9 days and 9 nights and 41 years deep into this thing with me, you have. The word was not a curse. It was not haunted or cursed or damned. The clerk of Kellam County was a plain man like all of them, a keeper of accounts, and the word he wrote across the top of Elias Renner's report on the true and terrible census of Sorrel Hollow, the hollow that had 31 souls in 1880 and 3 dusty impossibilities in 1891, and had, in fact, taken every one of them and warned them. Still the word that plain, frightened, accurate man wrote across the file, and underlined, and never looked at again, was one word, and the word was settled. Settled. The way you mark an account that is closed, the way you mark a debt that has been paid in full, or a matter that has been dealt with and need never be revisited. He did not mean it as horror. He meant it as bookkeeping. He meant, this is finished. This is squared. We will not be opening this ledger again. But you and I, sitting here, know the other weight the word carries, don't we? Settled, like ground settles, like snow settles into a hollow until the ground forgets it ever had a shape of its own. Like a thing that has been walking a long time, finally sits down in a chair at the center of a snowless clearing, facing the mouth of the hollow, and settles in to wait. The clerk wrote settled and closed the file, and he was right. More right than he knew, in more ways than he meant. The account of Sorrel Hollow was settled, and the thing in it settled in. And it is, as far as anyone knows, as far as any record shows, settled there still. But we are not quite done with Elias Renner, because a thing that has counted you once keeps your name in its ledger, and 41 years is a long time. But it is not to thin ground, to a hunger older than a county, any time at all. And there was one more night, one last night, near the very end of Renner's long-marked, careful life, when the account he thought was settled came, quietly, in the dark, to see if it might be reopened. It was the winter of 1932, 41 years, almost to the week, since Elias Renner had walked down out of Sorrel Hollow into Coy Aldis's wagon. He was 70 years old now, retired from the surveying these 10 years, living alone but for the housekeeper in the plain house in the Alleghanies with the oak bar on the door, and he was, by every account, near the end of his life. His heart was failing, slowly, the way hearts do, and the doctor had told him to expect the winter to be hard, and it was. And on a night in the deep of that winter, the housekeeper being gone home to her own family for the Christmas week, Elias Renner was alone in his house on a night of heavy snow, and the account that the clerk had marked settled came, one last time, to see if it might be squared a different way. He wrote about it. Of course he did. It is the last thing in the last of a long shelf of surveyor's daybooks he kept all his life, and the hand is an old man's hand now, shaky in a different way than the eighth night hand had been shaky, but it is the same voice, dry and careful and exact, the voice of a man who wrote down the price of a coffin, still writing down what was true, because writing it down was how he kept his grip on it, to the very end. And what he wrote is this, that on that night of heavy snow, alone, with his failing heart, with the wind rising the way it rose on the 9th night, 41 years gone, he woke in the dark to a sound at his window, and it was humming, low, tuneless, barely a sound at all, holding the note a beat too long. Before I tell you what he did, I want you to understand how he had spent the 41 years that led to that window, because it changes what the window meant. He had not spent them forgetting, That is the thing. Most men, given 41 years and 100 miles, would have let a thing like Sorrel Hollow soften into a story they half believed they'd exaggerated, a young man's nightmare gone gray and harmless with distance. Renner did not let it soften. He could not. The marks would not let him. But more than that, he chose not to, and here is how we know. Among his papers, kept all those years, there was a second set of daybooks, not the surveyor's daybooks, a private set, and in them, once a year, every year, on the 1st of December, the anniversary of the 9th night, Elias Renner wrote the whole thing down again, from memory, the whole account of the 9 days, start to finish, every year, in a hand that aged slowly across the decades from a young man's firm stroke to an old man's tremor, 41 times, 41 retellings of the same 9 days, each one complete, each one exact, each one. This is the part that undoes me, each one ending with the same line, written every 1st of December for 41 years. I remember it, so that I will not forget it, so that if it ever comes again, I will know it, and know what to say. He was keeping his own account the way Rachel Sallow kept hers, the way Orpha Meese kept hers, the way the keepers always kept theirs, refusing, year, by main force of will, to let the memory go thin, because he had understood, on the ridge, the thing the old woman told him, that forgetting is the door the hollow really wants open, and that the only defense any human being has ever had against it is the stubborn, lonely, unglamorous work of remembering out loud. He made himself, in exile, a keeper of one. He kept the account of a hollow 100 miles away that he would never see again, once a year for 41 years, against the possibility, the certainty, it turned out that it was not done with him. And so, when the humming came at his window on that last snowbound night, Elias Renner was, of all the lonely souls that Hollow ever reached for, the single most prepared human being who ever heard it, because he had spent 41 years rehearsing, in the dark, every 1st of December, exactly what he would say if it ever came again. That is the difference between the marks being a wound and the marks being a weapon. He had spent his whole ruined life turning the one into the other. I want you to understand what that is, that this thing could reach him, 70 years old, 100 miles and 41 winters away from the thin ground, in a plain house on thick, ordinary earth. Orpha Meese had said the hunger could only reach through the thin place, that it could do nothing to you if you didn't come and be lonely on top of it. And I think that was true, mostly, for most of Renner's life. But I think there is an exception the old woman didn't tell him, or didn't know, or was too kind to say, and I think the exception is death. I think that as a man comes near his own death, the ground under him, wherever he is, begins to go thin. I think dying is itself a thinning, a wearing away of the floor between here and whatever is on the other side. And I think the hunger that had counted Elias Renner once, 41 years before, had simply been waiting patient, the way it was patient around the chair, the way it walked, its slow groove waiting for a lonely soul to come up the trace, waiting for the one night at the end of his long life, when the floor of his own dying would go thin enough to reach through. And on that night of snow in 1932, it came, and it hummed at his window, and it said, in the voice it had learned so well, and never forgotten, the voice of a German cooper's daughter dead since 1891. Elias, it's so cold out here, and I've been so alone. Won't you let me in now? You're so tired. You don't have to bar the door anymore. Just this once. Just let me in, and it will be over, and you'll never be alone again. And here is the thing. Here is the last turn of it. And I've thought about it a great deal, and I'm going to give it to you as Renner gave it, and let you weigh it for yourself, because he did not fully explain it, and I don't think it can be fully explained, and I don't think it should be. An old man, 70 years old, heart failing, alone in the snow, tired, so tired, after 41 years of barring the door and counting the numbers and flinching from every hum, 41 years of holding a door shut against the one thing in all the world he had ever most wanted to open it to. And the voice at the window is right about one thing. He is tired, and it is offering him the one thing the ritual never could not survival, but rest. An end to the counting, an end to the bar on the door. And a man that tired, that near the end, might reasonably ask himself, what now is there left to protect? What is the counting for at 70 with a failing heart alone? Why not, at the very last, open the door? Why not let the wanting win just this once at the end, when the end is coming anyway? He got up. The daybook records it plainly. He got up out of his bed, on his old man's legs, in the dark and the cold, and he crossed the room toward the window, and the voice, and for the first time in 41 years, some part of him, he wrote, was not counting, and was not afraid, and was ready. He crossed the whole room. He put his hand on the cold frame of the window, and the humming rose, glad, triumphant, holding the note. And then Elias Renner, 70 years old, heart failing, hand on the window in the dark, did the thing that had saved him at 29, the small, dry, true thing, the surveyor's thing, the only weapon he had ever had. He listened all the way in, closer than his tired, breaking heart could stand. He listened to the voice that said, "Won't you let me in?" And he listened for the one thing that was wrong, and he found it. The same wrong thing, the very same one, 41 years later, unchanged, because the hunger cannot learn the thing it does not have. The voice said he was tired. The voice said he never had to bar the door again. The voice said it would be over and he would never be alone. But the voice did not say the one thing that Marta, living Marta, his Marta, who ate her supper with appetite, and hummed low over the account book, and teased him for his knotted stomach. The one thing that Marta, who loved him, would have said first, before anything, seeing him old and failing and tired at the end of a hard life, it did not tell him to rest. It did not say, "Lie down, my love, you're tired, go back to bed, keep yourself warm, live." It did not want him to live. Everything it said was a door pulled outward, toward the cold, toward the window, toward it. Not one word of it wanted him warm and alive and in his own bed. And Marta had never in her life wanted anything for him but that he be warm and fed and alive. The voice had her sound. It had, after 41 years, her every intonation. But it did not have her love, because love was the one thing it had never been able to take from anyone, the one thing that stays with the dead and does not come back wearing their face, and its not having her love was, in the end, the wrong thing, the same as the supper, the same as the humming, the same as it ever was. It wanted him. She would have wanted him to live. And Elias Renner, 70 years old, took his hand off the window, and he said the last words in the last day book, the last thing we have from him, and I'll give them to you exactly, he said, out loud, into the dark, to the humming at the glass. No. You never once told me to go back to bed. She'd have told me to go back to bed. Good night. And he went back to bed. And he did not open the window. And in the morning, the snow at the window was smooth and unbroken, and there were no tracks in it. None. The way there were no tracks under the loft window 41 years before. And the humming was gone. And the account was, for the last time, and by his own hand, and on the strength of one true thing, left unsquared. Elias Renner died 3 weeks later, in his sleep, in his own bed, with the door barred, of the failing heart the doctor had warned him of. An old man, at peace, in the ordinary way that we would all wish to go. The housekeeper found him, "Come back after the Christmas week." And she said, for she was asked, gently, later, when the small, strange facts of his passing became a quiet local wonder. She said that the house was as it always was, the door barred from the inside with the oak bar in its brackets, exactly as he left it every night of the 30 years she'd kept house for him, so that the men who came had to take the door off its hinges to get in, because a door barred from the inside by a man who dies alone in the night cannot be opened from without, which is a small, ordinary fact of carpentry. And also, when you have heard this whole story, something more. He had barred the door on his last night the way he barred it on every night, against a thing that came only once more at the very end, and went away with nothing. And she said one thing further, the housekeeper, that I cannot prove and will not insist on, but will give you. Because she gave it, and because she had no reason to invent it and did not seem to understand its weight, she said that on the last morning, the snow outside the old man's bedroom window, the window that faced the yard, was smooth and deep and unbroken, no track in it, nothing but that the sill of that window, on the inside, was wiped clean of the winter's dust in a single arc, as though a hand had rested there on the inside of the glass and drawn back. She thought he must have stood at the window in the night, poor old soul, looking out at the snow before he went back to bed and did not wake. And perhaps he did. Perhaps that is all it was. But you and I know what he wrote, that last night, in the last day book, and we know that he stood at that window and put his hand on the frame, and took it off again, and said no, and went back to bed. The clean arc in the dust on the inside sill is where his hand rested. That is as close as the thing ever got. The inside of his own window, one last time, on the last night of his life, and the truth, said out loud. One last time. Sent it back into the snow that keeps no tracks. He was not taken. He died his own death, which is the one victory that a story like this allows, and it is not a small one. He beat the hollow twice, once at 29 on the thin ground where it was strongest, and once at 70 on his own thick ground at the very end, when it came the long way round, through the thinning floor of his own dying to try one last time. Twice a thing older than the county reached for Elias Renner, and twice it went away with nothing, because twice a plain, careful, grieving man found the one true thing it could not fake, and said it out loud in the dark. That is the whole of his defense. That is all any of us would have. The truth, said out loud, in the dark, when the wanting is a flood over your head. It doesn't sound like much. It was enough. Twice, it was enough. Among his effects, and I told you at the start we'd end with what was found among his effects, and here it is among his effects, the people who cleared the plain house in the Alleghenies found the ordinary things an old surveyor leaves, the day books, the instruments, the oak bar and its iron brackets, taken down now and wrapped in cloth, and they found one thing more, wrapped in the same cloth as the bar, kept all those years, that none of them understood, and that we, now, are perhaps the only people ever to understand. They found the 3 notebooks from Sorrel Hollow, the census that was never finished, the copied rules, the whole account of the 9 days and the 9th night, kept for 41 years, the only witness, the crack in the county's long deliberate forgetting, and tucked inside the 3rd notebook, at the page where Rachel Sallow's copied rules broke off mid-word, they found a single dried apple. 1. Withered to almost nothing after 41 years, but recognizable still, a dried apple of the kind that hung in the cold front room of the first empty cabin, of the kind the Vearn stewed soft with honey, and pressed on him, "More, brother, have more." He had taken it out of the hollow with him. He had kept it 41 years, and no one who found it knew why. And I cannot tell you for certain why, because he never wrote it down, the one thing, perhaps, that the man who wrote down everything could not find words for. But I think I know. I think he kept it the way you keep the thing that nearly killed you, to remind yourself it was real, and that you survived it, and what it cost. Or I think, and this is the reading I can't shake, the one that keeps me up, I think he kept it because it was, in the end, the only thing he had left that had come from the same place she almost came back from. A dried apple from the cold front room of a haunted hollow. The nearest thing to a relic that a man like that, marked like that, was ever going to allow himself. He barred his door against her for 41 years, and he kept one dried apple wrapped in cloth beside the bar, all that time, and carried it to his grave. Both of those things are true. That is what grief is. That is the whole of what this story has ever been about. And I will tell you the last small thing the people who cleared his house noticed and did not understand. And only we can understand now. The apple was withered almost to nothing, hard and dark and light as a husk, the way an apple goes after 41 years. But it had never once been allowed to rot. A dried apple, kept dry, kept careful, turned now and again so the damp would not take it, the way you tend a thing you mean to keep. 4 decades he had tended it. The one thing he brought out of that dark hollow he had kept from rotting for 41 years, the way he could not keep her. A barred door with one hand on it, and, in the other hand, held gently, kept dry, kept turned, a small, dark sweetness he could neither eat nor throw away nor let decay. That is how he loved. That is how the marked ones love. Hold that, too, when you turn off the lamp. I have told a good many of these now, a good many hollows and lakes and long dark roads, and people ask me sometimes why I keep coming back to this one shape, the grief and the thin place, and the thing that wears the dead, and whether it isn't finally just the one story told over and over in different snow, and I've come to think it is, and that the sameness is the point, and that Elias Renner would have understood the point better than anyone, because the point is, the thing he spent 41 years writing down every 1st of December, in a hand that shook worse each year, that the danger never changes, and so the telling must never stop. Every one of these stories is the same story, because every one of us carries the same unlatched door. It is the oldest human fact there is, older than any hollow, older than the thin ground itself, that we love, and that the ones we love are taken from us, by fever or by years or by the plain arithmetic of time, and that some cold hour of every grieving night we would give anything, our sense, our safety, our very lives to have them back for one more supper, one more murmured evening, one more low, tuneless hum from the next room, meaning the house is alive. That wanting is not a flaw in us. It is the best thing in us. It is love, with nowhere left to go. And the horror of a place like Sorrel Hollow is not that it invents some alien evil to frighten us with, but that it takes the best thing in us, the love, the wanting, and turns it gently into the hook that pulls us down. That is why these stories are worth staying up for, worth the 3 hours in the dark, worth the small chill they leave behind that keeps you checking your own door for a night or two after. They are not really about the dead coming back. They are about how much we would let them cost us if they did, and about the plain, hard, unglamorous grace of a man who loved his wife past all reason, and still, on the 9th night, and again 41 years later, found it in himself to say to her shape at the door, "Not you. Go on. I'll come the honest way, in my own time, and it will be the real you I find, or it will be nothing, but it will not be this." That is the bravest thing I know of anyone doing. He did it for love. He refused the false thing because he honored the true one too much to accept a copy. Hold that, above all the horror, when you turn off the lamp tonight. The man survived by loving her correctly. That is the whole secret. That is the only charm against the thin ground there has ever been. So let me bring you back out now, the way coy Aldous brought Renner out, down the trace, back onto the thick, ordinary ground of your own warm room, your own lamp, your own barred or unbarred door. Let me ask you what I asked you at the start, now that you've been all the way in and all the way back. I asked you whether you'd ever stood at the mouth of a place and felt that it was already full. Whether you'd ever noticed the birds had all learned to be quiet. I want to ask you the harder version now, the one the whole story was really asking. Is there a door in you that's unlatched? A name you'd open it for, you don't have to say more than the name. I asked you that a while back, in the dark, and some of you did, and I read every one of them. Because here is the last true thing, the thing Orpheus knew, carding her wool above the thin ground, the thing Elias Renner learned twice and paid for all his life. The hollow is not the danger. The hollow is just thin. The wanting is the hook, and it's inside you. And it was inside you before you ever heard a word of this tonight, and no story I tell you can take it out. All I can do, all Renner could do, all the widow Salo tried to do in a book that stopped mid-word is tell you it's there, so that on some cold night of your own, when the floor goes thin and something you loved and lost hums low outside your window and asks you, so gently, to just let it in, you might remember, in the first cold instant, to listen all the way in and find the one thing that's wrong, and say it out loud, and go back to bed, because the thing that loved you would want you to go back to bed. The thing at the window never does. That's the case. That's Sorrel Hollow, settled on the map and settled in the ground, and Elias Renner, who beat it twice and kept the apple. If it got its hook in you the way it got its hook in me, if you're sitting there now, checking, without quite meaning to, that your own door is shut, then you already know why I make these. What the snow kept, 12 of them, the links below, 12 winters and 12 hollows and 12 doors, and this was one. If you've got a hollow of your own, a place in your own family's memory, a story from your own county, a night at a window you've never told anyone about, put it in the comments. Every one of these started as somebody's comment, somebody who couldn't sleep, somebody who finally wrote it down. The next case is already being written down. It's a lake and a name called up out of the water and a boy who counted the wrong thing. That's all I'll say. I'll have it for you soon. And before I let you go, one last thing. Because I promised at the very start that I keep my promises, and because it is the thing I most want you to carry out of the dark with you, if tonight, or some night, you find yourself doing what a good many people do at the end of one of these, lying in the quiet with the story still on you, and you think of someone, a name rises, a face, a voice, someone the plain arithmetic of time has taken from you, do not be afraid of the wanting. That is the mistake the hollow counts on, that you will be ashamed of how much you still want them back, and will hide it and let it curdle in the dark into an unlatched door. Don't. The wanting is love, and love is the best of you, and there is no shame in it, and never was. The whole of Renner's long, hard grace was not that he stopped wanting Marta back. He never stopped, not for one of the 15,000 nights he lived without her, but that he learned to want her back. The true way, the honest way, the way that waits and remembers exactly, and refuses the copy not out of fear, but out of faith that the real thing, whatever it is, wherever it is worth more than a warm forgery at a cold door. Love your dead precisely. Remember them in their real particulars, the trailing off hum and the appetite at supper and the small, foolish, endearing habits, and speak of them out loud to the living, so the memory stays sharp and whole and cannot be counterfeited, and you will find that this is not only the charm against the thin ground, but the truest way there is to keep them, warm and exact, and yours on the good side of the line, where no hunger can put on their face. That is what the whole 3 hours has been for. Not to frighten you off your grief, to teach you to carry it the way Renner carried it, openly, honestly, precisely, and with the door barred not against them, never against them, but against the thing that would wear them to get in. Until then, bar your door tonight. Not because anything's coming, just because it's a good habit, and because a plain, careful man once kept it 41 years and died in his own bed, at peace, of his own heart, with the door barred and one dried apple wrapped in cloth beside it. Sleep warm, eat your supper, remember them the true way. And if you hear humming at the glass low and tuneless and held a beat too long, you go back to bed. Good night. Rest.